And I'm going to tell you what the evidence for evolution is. But before I do that, I have to tell you what scientists mean by when they say something is true. And when we say the theory of evolution is true, what do we mean by a theory? And what do we mean by the theory of evolution? And then I want to present the evidence for why that theory is true in a scientific sense. And I'm doing this for several reasons. I don't think I need to convince people in this audience that evolution is true. You wouldn't be here otherwise. But perhaps you don't have the armamentarium of evidence under your belts to talk to your neighbors or your relatives about why it's true. The second reason is that maybe you don't realize how multifarious this evidence really is. It's not just the fossil record. It comes from 6 or 7 different areas of biology, all of them confluent in this truth of the hypothesis that Darwin proposed 150 years ago. And finally, the evidence for evolution is just really cool stuff. It's interesting, it's amazing, it's astounding, it's staggering. And that's what my book is about, that's what Richard's book is about. So that's what I'm going to do for the rest of this talk. First of all, I have to get clear what we mean by a scientific fact. What do we mean when we say that something is true scientifically? We don't mean true beyond all possible doubt in the absolute truth sense. We mean, and I believe this definition was first raised by Stephen Jay Gould, it's an assertion for which there is so much evidence that it would be perverse to deny it. And by that, I mean that those people who are capable of judging the evidence, if almost all of them say that that's true, then it's true. And that's what we mean in science. So when I say something in science is true, it's like this desk is true. There may be some philosophers out there that say, well, just because I can knock on this and make a sound doesn't mean that this thing is really there. But the vast majority of you would agree that this desk is there. And I'm standing behind a lectern, and I will try to propose that there's as much evidence for evolution as there is for the fact that this lectern is here before you. Okay? And so that kind of evidence is true for atoms. You'd have to be perverted to deny that atoms were the constituents of elements. There are some people out there undoubtedly who don't, but who do deny it, but they're a minority. Same with pathogenic bacteria. And the evolution falls in that class as well. I will maintain that evolution is just as true in the sense I mentioned as are the existence of atoms as the constituents of elements, and pathogenic bacteria for causing disease like strep throat and gonorrhea. Okay? Now, evolution is a theory. It's called a theory, but it's a theory in the scientific sense in which it's not just a wild speculation or a guess, like it's my theory that the Cubs have a good chance next year, which is a really bad hypothesis, not a theory. It's a group of propositions meant to explain something about nature, and that's what Darwin proposed in 1859. I'll tell you the constituents of the theory of evolution in a minute. So evolution began life as a theory, really formally in 1858 when Darwin and Wallace first wrote about it. And what happens is that a theory, that one in 1858, begins to gradually attain facthood as more and more pieces of evidence come down in favor of it, and no evidence is found to refute it. Okay? So a theory becomes fact. Evolution has become a fact, and I will maintain that you are perverse, or you're a moron, or you simply can't understand the nature of evidence, or you're so blinded by religious considerations that you just reject all evidence, if you do not see that evolution is true. Okay, that's my fulmination for the moment. Now on to the positive stuff, the evidence for evolution. Okay, first we have to know what the theory of evolution is, and if you ask somebody, an average educated person, what the theory of evolution is, they won't be able to answer. They'll just say things evolve. And that's one of the parts of evolution, but it's not all of it. There's actually what I call 5 constituents of the theory, some of which hang together, some of which are independent of one another, all of which have to be tested and verified if you're going to say that this package that we call the theory of evolution is true. Okay, what are they? First of all, evolution occurs. Populations change over time. And by change, I mean they change genetically. The genetic constituents of a population, the kind of DNA that is shared by members of that population, undergoes temporal change. Second of all, that change is not instantaneous, but gradual. It varies. I mean, evolution can occur on scales of 10 years or 100 years, and more likely thousands to millions of years, but it does not happen overnight, except in very rare cases. So we're not talking about an instantaneous genetic change that changes like the population of dinosaurs into a population of birds. That was once thought to be the way evolution occurred. We no longer think that that's true. So that's part 2. Now remember, these are somewhat independent. You can verify that things evolve, but the fact that they evolve gradually, they don't have to. They can change overnight. Okay, 2 independent propositions. Third, and this is my own area of expertise, speciation occurs. You don't just see one lineage changing over time. Instead, you see lineages branch. Here's a case of what we call splitting. The formal word is speciation, where original lineage A branches into two new descendant species, B and C. And that usually takes a long amount of time. And this is the way that starting with a single ancestral species, somewhere about 3.5 billion years ago, we arrive at today's count of 10 million to 50 million species on Earth. You could not do that unless you had this branching process. This is what's responsible for the tree of life. There's some nice tree of life t-shirts outside that you can buy. Okay, and again, this has to be verified separately from evolution. We could have evolution but no speciation. In that case, we'd have a long evolved single species that was the descendant of the first species to occur. Now, this is proposition 4, which is sort of the reverse side of looking at proposition 3. That is, if you have a splitting process, but you look at it backwards, and again, this is what Richard did in Ancestor's Tale, you see that you have common ancestors. That every pair of species on Earth, no matter how closely or distantly related, if you go back far enough into the past, you'll find a single ancestral species that gave rise to them both. So this is proposition 4, which you can look at as 3b, the reverse side of speciation. All species share a common ancestry as a result of lineage splitting from one ancestral life form. This, for example, is the family tree of primates. You can see the many splitting events involved in the common ancestors. Our common ancestor with the chimp was about 7 million years ago, with the gorilla about 11 million years ago, with the lemurs about 40 to 50 billion years ago. So, and we could extend this back further and further and find common ancestors with birds, with frogs, with dandelions. Okay. And finally, the last part of evolutionary theory, and in many ways a very important one, is what causes evolution. And I will maintain that the vast amount of evolutionary change, although this is subject to dispute, is a result of the process of natural selection, the so-called survival of the fittest. And I will maintain that natural selection, or at least as part of the theory, is the sole process that can produce the appearance of design in organisms. The appearance of things that look as though God put them there to help the animal, like the elephant's trunk, the camel's hump, the polar bear's coat, and so on. So those are the 5 parts of evolutionary theory, and what I'm going to do now is show you the evidence that all of these 5 parts are true. Okay? And I hope you accept it at the end, and if you don't, you shouldn't be here in the first place. I really feel like I'm preaching to the choir so much on why am I doing this, but I like it. So what can I say? So evolution is a scientific theory. It makes predictions. If you just read Darwin's first paper before his book, before he gave any evidence 1 year before in 1858, you could predict from what Darwin said the following. If life originated in the Earth in the distant past and then evolved, subsequently splitting, we should see that the first detectable traces of life on Earth would be simple. You cannot start life from chemicals in a complex way. You don't get an elephant springing out of a primordial ooze, and only later would more complex forms evolve. The simplest prediction you can make. If you look at the fossil record, which is now ordered not only relatively, but absolutely, we know all the layers and we know all the dates that go with the layers, you see that it absolutely conforms to that prediction. We see the first real organisms on Earth that are undisputed are these cyanobacteria, or blue-green algae, that appear about 3.4 billion years ago, only about 1 billion years after the Earth was formed. And then more and more complex creatures form, shelled animals, land plants, fish, reptiles, and amphibian, one after the other, in an order which is almost predictable from looking at them today. And the simpler forms remain. It's not that the simpler forms are there and go away. We still have shellfish with us, we still have bacteria, we still have fish, but more and more complicated things come in on top of that. This absolutely violates the prediction that all life was created at one time and never changed again. Completely refuting what the Discovery Institute or most creationist organizations maintain. Okay. This alone should be enough to refute creationism. But as they say in the Ginsu knife ads, but wait, there's more. All right. Another prediction is that if evolution occurs within lineages and those lineages sometimes split, then we should be able to see that in the fossil record. We shouldn't just be able to see this progression from simple organisms to complex ones, with the simpler ones remaining. We should be able to trace a single lineage and see it changing over time. After all, that's what evolution is. And we should be able to see those lineages split so that we have an ancestor that divides into several descendants. And lo and behold, I could give you 300 or 400 cases of this, but I'll just give you a couple to hopefully convince you of this. Some of the best evidence for evolution in the fossil record are found from marine microfossils, which are these tiny planktonic organisms that live in the sea. And why they're so good for evolution is, first of all, they usually have hard skeletons. Second of all, when they die, they just fall to the bottom, automatically ensuring that they lie in the sediments. The sediments cover them up and preserve them. And you can get these whole groups of them, organisms. You can take a time slice of a single lineage of these organisms by simply drilling a core through the seafloor and then slicing that core into pieces, dating them, and following the lineage and how it looks and seeing how it changes. And here's one of them, a very simple organism. It's a diatom, a marine protist with a calcareous skeleton. And we can see that over the 1.7 million year slice of time, on the left here, and this is one characteristic of that, which is the size of the thing, an aspect of its size, that we see some evolutionary change happening. Sometimes it gets smaller, sometimes it gets bigger, smaller, bigger. Evolution doesn't always have to be unidirectional. There's no God propelling this. It's the environment, and the environment changes. So we see evolution here, but more important in this case, if we follow the core down, we see this as well, that we see the instant at which one lineage divides into two. That's not so easy in the fossil record, given the difficulty of fossilization. But in marine microfossils, it's easy. And lo and behold, what do we see? Evolution and speciation. And this lineage itself evolves, becoming smaller over the 1.5 million years that it exists. Okay, and I could give you case after case after case. I mean, if you're a creationist, you'd tell me, so what? These are just diatoms. Give me something interesting like a mammal and show me evolution in that. Okay, so here's a mammal. This is the horse. We have a really good fossil record of the horse, most of whose evolution took place in North America. Horses form a branching bush, just like many organisms do. There's no single lineage of horse, but if you follow some lineages, you see evolutionary change. One famous lineage is the one that goes from this common ancestor, Hyracotherium, a cute little animal about this big, evolving into the modern horse. And you see all kinds of evolutionary changes occurring on that lineage. It loses its toes, starts off with 5 toes, the 2 outer ones disappear, then the 2 middle ones disappear, and you're left with 1 toe left. It's an example of evolution. That's for creation. But they don't all do that. It's not like every lineage of horse is forced to do this. Some of the lineages get smaller. So we see this branching bush, the speciation event, and in following some lineages, we see evolutionary change. Okay, I'm not going to bore you to death by showing you example after example after example. You can go to my book or you can go to Richard's book to see that. Okay? Let's go to some other predictions that evolution makes. Take the one on common ancestry and speciation. Okay. If all creatures share common ancestry, as Darwin maintained in 1858, where there was no evidence at the time, what do you expect to see? Well, we should be able to find some evidence of those common ancestors. We should be able to go back in time and see lineages converging, and things that are supposed to be related, we should be able to find their common ancestor. Okay? We should be able to find these transitional forms. Okay? Now, 2 of the groups that morphologists, people that study the way animals look, and physiologists, the way their bodies work, have told us before Darwin's time that birds appear to be closely related to reptiles. There's a number of similarities in the way their hearts are structured, and in the way their circulatory systems are structured, that makes us think that perhaps birds evolved from reptiles. And we see reptiles early in the fossil record and no birds. And later on, about 150 million years ago, we still have reptiles, but now we see birds for the first time. So if it's true that birds came from reptiles, we should be able to find a common ancestor between those 2. That's a prediction, okay? It was not known to be true. It was not known to be verified in Darwin's time. It was predicted, okay? So what we would like to see is a common ancestor of birds and reptiles, that one species, all of whose descendants on one branch gave rise to reptiles, the other descendants gave rise to birds. Now, finding a single species in the fossil record is almost impossible, given that less than 0.1% of all species that ever lived we know as fossils, due to the vagaries of fossilization, preservation, and erosion. But what we can hope to find, even if we can't find this single species, is at least what we call transitional forms. If birds did evolve from reptiles, then their early ancestors were reptilian, and they later became more bird-like. So somewhere along that branch, we should be able to see some creatures that show features of both reptiles and birds. Okay? This was, again, there were none known in Darwin's time. There actually was the famous Archaeopteryx fossil, which was tattooed on a young lady I saw yesterday, half Bill Maher's friend, half bird, half reptile. But Darwin didn't realize its significance. And now in the last 20 or 30 years, we've been able actually to find these transitional forms. What better example of an evolutionary prediction fulfilled can you imagine? Here's one of them. This is found in China in very fine still sediments. This is Sinornithosaurus millenii. I think this is about 150 million years old. Maybe I'll get the date in a minute. If you know your dinosaurs, this looks very much like a theropod dinosaur, those two-legged bipedal carnivorous dinosaurs like T-Rex. There are many of them. Birds are supposed to have evolved from little ones. This is one of them, and you can see right off that this looks like a reptile. It has teeth. You can see the teeth there. Its front limbs are free. If you look at a chicken wing, the digits are all fused. This one, they're all free like a lizard. And it has this long bony tail. Okay? So it looks, for all the world, like a theropod dinosaur. But thanks to the sediments in which this thing was preserved, it's feathers. You can see feather imprints right there. Okay? And so what we have here is a feathered dinosaur. And in the last 20 or 30 years, we've been digging these up with increasing frequency. One was found about 2 weeks ago, which is even earlier than this. Moreover, not only do they fulfill all the features of a transitional form, they're reptiles, but they have feathers on them. They occur at the right time in the fossil record. This is about 125 million years ago, well after dinosaurs had already existed, but before modern birds appeared. So it's not just that it's intermediate in appearance, but it's intermediate in when we see it occur in the fossil record. If this thing lived 500 million years ago, it's not a good candidate for a bird-reptile transitional form. What did this look like? Probably something like that. This is an imaginative reconstruction. In fact, T-Rex itself may have been covered with fluff. We're not sure, but they don't display that in the museums because it takes away its fearsome aspects. Okay. Another example of these transitional forms, which were only recently found, were whales, which were long thought to have evolved from land animals much like the water chevrotain or a hippopotamus, so-called artiodactyls or even-toed animals. But there were no missing intermediates. And in fact, if you look at the creationist literature about 30 years ago, you're going to see, well, they tell us that whales evolved from something like cows. Well, that's just stupid. What would that look like? And then the creationists would show a slide of an animal that the front half was a heifer and the rear half was a fish, and the thing would be standing in the water with a question mark over its head, like, where am I supposed to go? And everybody would laugh and say, well, that's just stupid. Evolutionists cannot possibly hold such ridiculous ideas. And then people began going to the Middle East and prospecting, and they began to find, first of all, ancestors of whales, things like the water chevrotain, which looked very much like the thing that could develop into an aquatic animal. Whales are secondarily aquatic. They come from the water. They come from the land onto the water. And now we have this whole sequence of things that occur not only in morphological sequence, from things that were sort of hanging around the edge of the water, sort of going into the water with a little bit reduction of the rear limbs, evolution of the front limbs. Here's a picture of one of these things. And finally, things that are losing their rear limbs and becoming more and more aquatic, all the way down to modern, fully formed whales. All this action takes place in perfect temporal sequence. The earliest forms are the most terrestrial, the latest forms are more aquatic, all in 10 million years. Okay. So it took us to go from like a land mammal, like a small horse, to a whale in 10 million years. That's not much longer than it took humans to evolve from our common ancestor of the chimpanzees. So this is very rapid evolution. This is an absolute confirmation of the truth of evolution, at least in this lineage. Okay. Whoops, I think I missed something here. Let me go back. Okay, I'm missing a slide here. Sorry about that. It was a slide of a... Let's see if I can recover that one more time. No, I didn't. It was a slide of a dolphin having re-evolved hind legs. Atavisms that occasionally occur. Anyway, besides the predictions that I'm talking about, evolution also makes what I call retrodictions. That is, it doesn't necessarily predict phenomena, but there are bizarre phenomena that crop up that can be understood only in light of evolution. Here's one of them. This is an embryology. This is an embryo of a spotted dolphin at age 24 days. And if you look closely, you'll see that there are limb buds on this thing. As with all tetrapods, four-footed vertebrates, it begins life developing forelimbs and hind limbs. And you can see both of them. Now, you know that a spotted dolphin doesn't have hind limbs. They disappear. What happened? But they begin evolving in development. So anyway, this looks very much like an early human because all vertebrate embryos start out the same way. It has forelimbs and hind limbs. What happens is if you follow this thing embryologically, let's say look at it for another 3 weeks, the forelimbs continue to enlarge to form paddles, and the hind limbs go away. Okay, now why is that? You have to ask yourself, why would an animal that only has 2 functioning limbs, the forelimbs of a dolphin, begin to develop rear ones and then they disappear? If you're a creationist, you have to explain this. You can say, well, we don't know what those limb buds are, even though in all other tetrapods, those develop into the legs. Or maybe the creator is trying to fool us into thinking that dolphins evolved like whales from terrestrial animals. But really, it makes sense from the view, and we can now support this with fossils, that dolphins evolved from animals that had 4 legs and lost the rear 2. Sorry, and here's the missing slide. There's a dolphin. This is an atavistic mutant dolphin, and look at that. It has 2 hind legs right where the limb buds are developed. In this case, the limb buds failed to go away. They continued to develop into some sort of rudimentary hind limbs. This is very rare. These 2 things that you see in the dolphin, those aren't there on dolphins usually. If you dissect them, you find limb bones in them. What's the explanation? Retrodiction. Evolution makes sense of this. Creationism doesn't. Okay. It's not necessarily predicted, but it's something that makes sense only in light of evolution. Here's something that we have. One of our bizarre embryological features. Every one of you, at the age of 6 months, developed a thick coat of hair on your body called the lanugo. And you can look this up in pediatric textbooks. The doctors always mention it. They never say what it means. Why, at the age of 6 months, do we develop a thick coat of hair in the embryo, which is then shed shortly before birth? If you're born prematurely, you sometimes are born with this coat of hair, but it always goes away. What does it mean that we develop this feature and lose it? How does it make sense? Well, if you're a creationist, it does not make sense. And I'm not trying to bash creationists here, although I really am. What I'm trying to do is rule out the alternative hypothesis that's in opposition to evolution, which is that God made this stuff or some celestial being. Well, why would God put hair in an embryo that's floating around in water that's 37 degrees centigrade or 98.6? It has no adaptive significance at all. You don't need hair when you're immersed in liquid that's at your body temperature. Well, if you look at a juvenile ape or a chimpanzee, at about the same stage of development, it begins to develop hair too, and then it loses it. We start to do the same thing. Sorry, the chimpanzee keeps the hair, and the gorilla keeps the hair, our relatives do. We lose it. So it makes sense in view of we probably descended from animals that were hairy, like chimps and gorillas, and we're now the naked ape, but we've aborted that hair development, not from the outset, but at a certain stage of development. We have many vestigial organs that can only be explained by evolution. Here's one of them. If you look at whale skeletons in natural history museums hanging from the top, you'll often see these 2 limb bones suspended from the bottom. They're not connected to the rest of the skeleton. They're hanging there by wires. Why are they there? They don't seem to have any function at all. Well, any embryologist or morphologist will say, well, those are the remnants of the vestigial limbs. Those are the bones.
Jerry started off as a fairly straight for this work. Like the most...
And thanks, Andrew. I never had an introduction like that. I'll say what Sally Field said after she got the Oscar, which is, geez, you must really love me. Something I haven't discerned in 30 years of knowing him. So I feel like I'm preaching to the choir a bit because this is a biologically sophisticated audience. So I'm going to talk about the evidence for evolution. Presumably most of you know that, plus my advisor, who of course knows the evidence for evolution, is in the audience, Dick Lewington, and a Nobel laureate who works on the origin of life. So I'm a little bit worried, but I'll muddle through somehow. When I was first asked to give this talk, I was asked to share the platform with E.O. Wilson, and we'd have a conversation together. And I thought about that for about a millisecond and realized that that's like having a cage at the zoo in which there's a peacock and a pigeon. And which one are you going to look at? So I just decided that the pigeon better have his own cage, and I'd give my own talk. I guess Ed has already talked in this series, so that's okay. So tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit, or riff on the book, which you can buy, Why Evolution is True, talk a little bit about the evidence for evolution. It's a consilience in the Wilsonian sense, in that many strands of evidence come together, and segue, I guess, into the reasons why Americans don't like evolution so much, and you all know that. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about religion and the dysfunctionality of American society. But most of it will be... I didn't say that religion was the dysfunction of American society. It turns out it's not, but it's connected to that, and that's something I'll talk about at the end. But I want to start with the facts, and this is a little bit about the American resistance to evolution. This is a paper that was published in 2006 by Miller et al. In Science, in which they ranked 32 countries in terms of the acceptance of their inhabitants of the theory of evolution, actually human evolution. So the length of the blue bars, this is 100%, is the proportion of people who accept evolution. The yellow is people that aren't sure, and red is people who think evolution, or at least human evolution, is false. And you can see there's Iceland and Denmark and Sweden are at the top with 80% acceptance, and things go downhill as you go further south in Europe. But the really embarrassing part is this, which is where we fall. Out of 32 countries, we're number 31 with acceptance of evolution of, well, it says here about 40%, but it turns out that's actually way too high. But nevertheless, it's a national embarrassment. The only country below us is a Muslim country, which is largely fundamentalist and has its own reasons for rejecting evolution. So this is an embarrassment. Imagine if you surveyed the countries of the world, or the technically advanced countries of the world, and you found out that only 40% of Americans accepted the germ theory of disease, or the theory that matter was made up of atoms. You'd say there was a crisis in understanding or education. Well, here it is for something that's just as true as the theory of atoms and germs, which is the theory of evolution. And I'll try to persuade you tonight of the truth of this theory if you aren't already, although I suspect that most of you already are. So I want to talk a little bit more about the resistance to evolution. So here's another poll that was taken by last year by the Gallup poll, in which a large sample of Americans was surveyed about how they thought humans came to be. They got three choices: you either evolved from an earlier species, which is straight naturalistic evolution; you're created by God in the last 10,000 years, poofed into existence, that's young Earth creationism; and human beings evolved, but that evolution was guided by God, either made the right mutations or installed the soul at the right point, and that's called theistic evolution. So here's the answers to that question. 40% of Americans were young Earth creationists. 38%, which is surprisingly high in my view, accept evolution but thought that God tweaked it, and 6% were unsure. Well, you can do the math and subtract for 100. Only 16% of Americans accept the way evolution the way we Americans or we scientists understand it, as a purely naturalistic, materialistic process. So that's 1 in 6 of your neighbors believes the way scientists do, or people who work in this museum. It gets worse if you ask Americans what they think should be taught to children in the public schools. They're given a choice of 4: evolution only, creation only, intelligent design, or all 3. And again, you can do the math. Only 12%, 1 in 8 Americans think that only evolution should be taught in the schools. And the other, you're either unsure, but most of them think that some mixture of evolution and creationism should be taught. And in fact, the most misguided answer is this: all 3. This is the American sense of fair play at work here. 55%. Let the kids sort it out, okay? It's like saying, okay, teach them astrology and astronomy and psychology and let them sort out who regulates human behavior. But it's pretty distressing. If you guys think that because you're in Massachusetts, you're the best in the country and you're sophisticated about these things, well, you're pretty good. But if you grade the public school standards for teaching evolution in the various states, you can see here the South gets Fs and stuff. But Massachusetts only gets a B, not an A. And the reasons for that are, first of all, Massachusetts state standards, at least according to this paper, disguises the fact that humans evolved. I don't know how they disguise it. And second of all, that cosmological evolution, or the origin of the universe, is not taught until high school. So it's put on. So for that reason, you guys are rated a B, which is okay compared to like Alabama and Texas, but you could do better. So do something about that disguised human evolution in your state school standards. Okay, so of course the result of this suspicion and dislike of evolution amongst Americans is that it causes these incursions into the public schools at regular intervals in which creationists or intelligent design people try to get their theories taught to people. This is the Dover case, you're probably aware of this, in 2005, in which intelligent design was mandated to be taught in Pennsylvania high school, and there was a big brouhaha in the courts. Unfortunately, it was struck down as not science. But this happens. These brush fires occur at regular intervals in America in which creationists try to get their misguided views taught in the public schools. So to try to combat this, I wrote the book, which is you can get, or join the museum, which is even better, and get a free copy, which lays out, hopefully in a non-confrontational and objective way, what the evidence for evolution was, trying to convince people that evolution was true so that this stuff wouldn't happen again. Now, it turned out that this is probably a misguided effort. There are certain branch of people in this country that you cannot convince with evidence, but I did the best I could. So for the next, say, 30 minutes or so, I'd like to talk about why evolution is true, the various lines of evidence for evolution, and what it is. The reason I wrote this book, besides just laying out the evidence, is sort of threefold. First of all, evolution is probably the supreme achievement of the human intellect, I think, even more so than calculus, because it tells us the true story of where we came from. And it's amazing recursion that this brain has figured out where this brain came from in the first place. It's a pretty marvelous thing when you think about it. Second of all, presenting evolution versus its alternative, which is creationism, tells people how hypotheses are tested scientifically. How do you adjudicate these two views of the origin of the universe and life in the face of evidence? And finally, the evidence is pretty cool. I mean, a lot of the evidence is very intriguing. I'll try to show some of the more gee-whizzy stuff tonight. So, and it comes from various areas of biology. It's drawn from, it's not just the fossil record. So I want to talk to you about why evolution is true. I won't ask you to raise your hands because those who think that it isn't true aren't going to raise their hands. But I'm sure there are at least a few people in here. And even if you accept evolution, I'd like you to know the reason why you should accept evolution, all the evidence for it. So to answer the question why evolution is true, first I have to tell you what we mean by truth in science. Since I'm telling you why the theory of evolution is true, I have to tell you what a scientific theory is to begin with, and then what the theory of evolution really is, because it's more than one thing. It's not necessarily what everybody thinks it is. And finally, the real stuff, the meat of the talk, the evidence why evolution is true. Okay. So what do we mean by a scientific claim being true? Those of you who practice science know the answer to this. We have no handle on absolute truth in science. There's no bell that goes off when we find a fact that says, okay, you've got the absolute truth now, you can stop. It's always provisional. So the best definition of scientific truth that I can think of is actually one that Steve Gould, who used to work in the museum, constructed, which is basically an assertion for which there's so much evidence that it would be perverse to deny it. I think that's it's a really good way to define scientific truth. It doesn't mean that it's an absolute truth. It just means you'd be dumb if you didn't look at this evidence and say this is the reality of nature. Okay? And here's a scientific truth. It's a theory as well, atoms. Scientific truth that infectious diseases are caused by viruses or bacteria. And what I'll try to convince you tonight is that there are just as many facts in support of evolution as there are of these other so-called theories as well. These things are theories and at once are scientific truths in the sense that you'd be dumb if you said you didn't think atoms existed. You'd be dumb if you didn't think cholera was caused by a microorganism. You'd be dumb or perverse if you said that you didn't think evolution occurred, which of course is more than 40% of Americans. Okay, so I hate to say that, but I mean it's not really dumb in the sense of stupidity. It's ignorant. Well, we'll go into this at the end of the talk. Okay, so we always speak of the theory of evolution, just as we speak of the theory of atoms and the germ theory of disease. What do we mean by a scientific theory? Creationists always dismiss evolution. You've heard this yourself. It's just a theory. Ronald Reagan did this in 1980. It's only a theory. I think that there are other things that are just as good. But a scientific theory is more than a hypothesis. I mean, a hypothesis or a guess. A hypothesis or a guess is something like the Celtics are going to win the playoff, which is not a very good hypothesis or guess. But a theory in science means more than that. It's a coherent group of propositions meant to explain facts about the world. So when we talk about the germ theory of disease, it is that the facts that we know about how diseases are transmitted point to microorganisms as the cause. Atoms are pointed to as the cause from many, many different lines of evidence as the fundamental chemical constituents of matter. So that's why we still call it the atomic theory and the germ theory of disease. But none of you doubt the fact that matter is made of atoms, or I hope that infectious diseases are caused by microorganisms. And the theory of evolution is just like that. It's a group of propositions, which I'll outline in a second, meant to explain facts about the real world. Okay, what's the difference between a theory and a fact? Steve Gould talked about this extensively in his natural history columns, and there is no difference, at least in my view. A theory is a set of propositions to explain facts about the real world. When a theory accumulates a certain amount of evidence that supports it, as we have for the theory of atoms, the theory of germ theory of disease, and the theory of evolution, then it graduates to facthood. Okay, so basically, when I say evolution is a theory, I can also say it's a fact at the same time. And it is. And I'll give you the evidence, which is in this arrow here. Okay, so what is the theory of evolution, the Darwinian theory? I mean, the theory of evolution is many things. Number one being the one that you think it is, which is that evolution happens. That is, organisms evolve. As an evolutionary geneticist, I define that as genetic change in populations over long periods of time. Okay, but there's actually 5 parts to the theory of evolution. And if you want to say it's true, you have to say that all 5 parts are true. Okay, so there's part 2, which is that it's usually gradual. And by gradual, I don't mean, you know, it takes gazillions of years for evolution to occur, but I mean it does not happen overnight. It takes hundreds or thousands or even millions of years for appreciable genetic change to happen in populations. Okay? These parts of the theory don't all stand or fall together. You can have evolution, for example, but it doesn't have to be gradual. So you have to support each of these pillars independently. Speciation occurs. This is my area of expertise. It's more than just evolution. You have to have lineages which branch to create descendant species. If this branching had not occurred, we'd still only have one highly evolved species with us today, the lineal descendant of the first organism. But we have at least 9 million species on Earth today, and that's because this branching process has occurred, and it's happened so profusely that now we have to represent the tree of life by this sort of circle of life, and even this is compressed considerably. There's the ancestral organism right there of all species, and then it's just branched into these gazillions of things here through the branching process. So we have to support that too. Okay? Now, the process that organisms split, the idea split, leads to the converse, that if you trace any pair of organisms back in time, in this branch here, for example, B and C, if you trace them back in time, you're going to find a single ancestor that was their common ancestor, the so-called missing link. So part 4 of evolution is that all species share a common ancestry. You can pick any 2 species on Earth, like a fern and a squirrel, and we can now trace back approximately when that common ancestor lived between these 2 species and when it lived using molecular data. But this, of course, this splitting process and this common ancestry has to be supported independently. Here's the common ancestry of humans and the primate lineage. We share a common ancestry with chimps about 7 million years ago, with gorillas about 10, orangutans about 13. What we mean by being most closely related to something means that our common ancestor with that thing existed more recently. So we're more closely related to chimps than we are to gorillas because our common ancestor with the chimps lived more recently than our common ancestor with the gorillas. You probably know all this stuff, so my apologies if I'm preaching to what you already know. And finally, the last part of the pillar of the theory of evolution is the idea that much of evolutionary change, although not all of it, is caused by the process of natural selection, which I will assume you know or have an inkling of because it takes too long to describe. It is the only force, it's not really a force, it's what happens. It is the only process that occurs that gives organisms the appearance of being adapted to their environments. The marvelous fins of the fish, the beak of the woodpecker, the spines of the cactus, and so on. And again, this is independent of what I said before. You can have all this stuff, points 1 to 4 occurring, and yet it might not have occurred largely by natural selection. There are other kinds of evolutionary processes that have been proposed to cause both adaptation and evolution. So these are the 5 pillars of the theory of evolution, and I'm going to try to support all of them in the talk. So what is the evidence? Evolution is a scientific theory. Most good scientific theories make predictions about what you should find if they are true, and that is also true of evolution. The first one, which is the most obvious one, is if life originated on Earth in the distant past, this is Jack Szostak's area of expertise, and evolved, we should see that the first organisms on Earth were very simple, at least the first fossilized ones, and that as time passed, organisms on average became more complex, and that the organisms that you find most recently in the fossil record would be the ones that most closely resembled the things that are on Earth today that are alive, because they're the ancestors of those things. You know this is the geologic column. You can see it from the Archean to the Quaternary, back from the origin of Earth at 4.6 billion years ago to the recent times. The earliest traces of life occur at 3.6 or 3.5 billion years ago, and those are stromatolites, blue-green algae, which they used to be called, they're known as cyanobacteria. They're these things. So the earliest forms of life that we do see fossilized about 3.5 billion years ago are indeed simple. Life obviously originated way before that, but the first things we see are there. And then as you go up, you see other forms coming in, fish, land, plants, and perhaps things that we find more complex towards the top. You don't see humans down here. You don't see dinosaurs up here. This is in line with what evolution predicts. Okay. Other predictions. there's speciation. Okay. So lineages sometimes split. We should be able to find examples of this splitting in the fossil record. And we should be able to find examples of common ancestry in the fossil record. Well, it's not that easy to find one lineage splitting into two in the fossil record, since it usually happens relatively quickly. But we do have evidence, and in fact, we've seen new species arise in a human lifetime. Here's an example of a new species arising in 1.7 million years. It's a diatom, a marine organism, which has a really good fossil record, because when they die, they just sink to the bottom of the ocean. They're covered by sediments. You stick a tube down in the ocean floor and pull it up, and there you have a record of millions of years of evolution by cutting into the core. So this is the diatom. One characteristic, the height of the organism, the height of the hyaline area. It's like this length in micrometers, and this is the age. So we're going up towards more recent times over a period of 1.7 million years. And you can see here that we see evolutionary change. It sort of bounces around. It's not directional, but it is indeed evolutionary change, and it's gradual. But I've left off part of this graph. If you actually look at the core carefully, you will see here's a splitting event, where this thing actually split at this point, or somewhere around there, into two different species. That one of them that became smaller in size, maybe because these were competing for food. Here's some fossil evidence for splitting. If you want, now people aren't impressed by diatoms, they want something more, they want a big charismatic organism. So here's the horse. We have a really good record of horse evolution, which mostly occurred in western North America, at least that's where the fossils are. And over a period of time, I think it's probably 25 million years, but I can't be sure about that. We start with a small animal about that big, Hyracotherium, and we can trace at least one lineage up to the modern horse there, in which there's substantial evolutionary change going on. Loss of toes. This one had 4. The toes gradually shrink and get smaller and smaller and smaller until we have only 1 toe in the modern horse, which is actually the hoof of the horse. It's walking on its single toe, the metatarsal. And there are other lineages as well. Lots of things are going on besides the loss of toes here. The animal's getting bigger. The teeth are getting bigger because it has to deal with grass, since the forests are being replaced by grassland. So there's all kinds of major evolutionary change going on. And you see gradualism, you see evolutionary change, and you see splitting, all in this branch of horse evolution. You can see it's not a simple lineal descendant from Hyracotherium to this horse. It's a branching pattern, just like our own ancestry of humans. Okay? Evolution makes further predictions. If creatures share common ancestry, then we should be able to find evidence of common ancestors for different species that live on Earth today. And here's one that was predicted in Darwin's time by Thomas Henry Huxley, who observed that there were certain similarities between birds and reptiles. They both lay eggs. There's similarities of their circulatory system and the way their hearts are constructed. And so Huxley and his contemporaries suspected that because we knew that reptiles were down there in the fossil record, but there were no birds 300 million years ago, that birds descended from reptiles. Okay, so that's a prediction that was made before we had any fossils to test it. What you want to look for, ideally, is the missing link. The missing link is that single species of reptile which gave rise to all modern birds on one hand and all modern reptiles on the other. So creationists will say, find us that species, and if you can't, you're out of luck. But evolution does not require that you find a single link to show that birds descended from reptiles. You don't need to do that. What you can do is find early birds, or the lineal ancestors of birds, that have reptilian characteristics at about the time that this branching is supposed to have taken place. So we don't really, when they say the missing link is still missing and therefore we don't have evidence that birds descended from reptiles, that's a false requirement. It's a too strict requirement. In fact, creationists say this all the time, and they'll make fun of this. I've been at lectures by creationists where they'll say, well, those stupid evolutionists tell us that birds evolved from reptiles. Well, okay, if you believe that, then this is what you're going to have to look for in the fossil record. This is called a crocoduck. It's a croc of something, but there it is. But you don't need this, because and I've been in audiences where the creationists will laugh and say, those stupid evolutionists, how could they think something like that? And they'll wave their Bibles if they have them. But in fact, we do have something like this, but it's even better because it is the real intermediate form between modern birds and reptiles. And here's one example. There's been in the last 20 years a huge number of fossil finds, mostly from China, of things that are sort of half reptilian and half bird. And here's one of them, Cyanothosauros millenii, which dates back to about 125 million years in the fossil record, which is after dinosaurs had already been in existence for some time, but before we find modern birds. So it's right where you'd expect it to be. Basically, this thing that you're looking at, you can't tell whether it's a bird or a reptile. It's very similar in its skeleton to the theropod dinosaurs. And here's theropod dinosaurs. You've seen them from Jurassic Park with these fast-running bipedal dinosaurs that might have been hot-blooded and were vicious, and some of them were quite small and bird-like. And here, their skeletons look almost like this one here. You can see the skeleton, Sinornithosaurus. It has dinosaurian characteristics. It looks very much like a theropod. It has teeth. Can't see them so well. There's a tooth there. Its fingers are unfused. If you look at your chicken wings, fingers are fused. They're not like that. This is reptilian. And it has this long bony tail, and you know from looking at the Pope's nose on your turkey that no bird has a long bony tail. But there are these things, and they're feathers. These are impressions of feathers. This thing was a feathered reptile. Well, some cladist is going to take issue with me here. A feathered thing which is similar to theropod dinosaurs, but has this new addition here. And it probably looks something like this. It appears at the right time in the fossil record, 125 million years ago. It probably looks something like this. I think it was in Nature or Science a couple weeks ago, they found an even earlier form of something like this, in which it was basically a dinosaur, but it had thin filaments of feathers on the thing. So feathers probably did not evolve to help these things fly. They evolved for other reasons, perhaps due to thermoregulation or species recognition or other reasons. But at any rate, what better thing can you have to show that birds evolved from reptiles? It's prediction that has been verified by many, many fossils like this. Here you have a dinosaur, a reptile, that has feathers. Okay, this is the crocoduck that creationists are always saying that we don't have. Whales are another story. In the last 30 years, whales were another mystery. I remember going to a lecture by Duane Gish, a famous creationist, at the University of California, in which he said, well, these stupid evolutionists tell us that whales evolved from artiodactyls, which are animals like cows. They're even-toed mammals. And he said, well, what would that require? And he showed a picture of an animal. The front half was a Jersey cow, and the back half was a fish. And it was standing on the edge of the water, but it had a question mark over its head, like, what am I? And all the creationists laughed in the audience. It's just stupid scientists. Well, okay, we didn't have the fossils then. So all we could say is we're pretty sure that whales evolved from tetrapods because there's so many affinities genetically and morphologically between artiodactyls, even-toed animals, and modern whales. Well, people have filled in this gap in the last 20 years. This is one of the most remarkable examples of an evolutionary prediction being fulfilled. Well, first of all, we found something that looks very much like the common ancestors of whales. It's like the muntjac, the small deer of Southeast Asia that's known to dive in the water to escape from predators and stay underwater for several minutes. We have this thing called Indohyus, which is very much like a muntjac, but it has certain ear structures which make us think that this is indeed the animal that gave rise to modern whales. And then we found all these things. We have a series going back, starting 50 million years ago and going to 42 million years ago, of things which progressively become less and less deer-like and more whale-like. Their limbs shrink, their front limbs turn into flippers, their rear limbs go away, the nostrils move at the top of the head to form a blowhole. The ears change so that there's no external openings. There's all kinds of modifications going on. And we have all these intermediate forms now that show this progressive loss. Here's one of them. I think this is Rhodocetus, but I'm not absolutely sure. You can find it in the book. And so this happened over a period of 8 million years. That's a remarkably fast rate of evolution. We evolved from our ancestor for chimpanzees. It took us about 7 million years of divergence. This is about the same amount of time, 8 million years, to go from a deer to a whale. Now, and we have the transitional form. So when creationists say we don't have one thing, one kind evolving into another kind, you cannot say that this and that are the same kind of animal, whether you use biblical kinds or species. Here we have a major evolutionary transition that's been was predicted and documented by fossils. And this is probably the best thing that's happened since Darwin, is the efforts of paleontologists to confirm him. We have fossil record of fish transforming themselves into amphibians. Tiktaalik, you've probably heard of Neil Shubin's work. We have amphibians turning into reptiles, reptiles turning into mammals, and reptiles turning into birds. And of course the human fossil record, which was posited by Darwin to exist in Africa in 1871. There were no early fossils then. probably the most dramatic evolutionary prediction that has been succeeded. And sure enough, in the 1920s, they began turning up human ancestry beginning with Australopithecus in South Africa. Okay. So we have all these predictions of the theory of evolution that have been verified. We have common ancestry, we have gradualism, we have genetic change in populations, and we have speciation. But there's also what we call retrodictions, things that make sense only in light of evolution but aren't necessarily predicted by evolution. There are all these biological puzzles in embryology, in morphology, and in physiology that people couldn't understand until Darwin's theory of evolution. And it was Darwin who first deduced most of this evidence in 1859. Here's one of them. This is a dolphin embryo, spotted dolphin embryo at 24 days. If you know your embryology, can everybody see this? Okay, I guess you can see it over there. These are the limb buds. This is the front limb. This is the hind limb. This looks remarkably like a human embryo, which is more evidence for evolution. This thing develops into the flipper. But why is there a hind limb bud? Why do dolphins have this thing? They don't have hind limbs. You can see that right there. There's nothing there, right? Well, why? It's because we now know from both fossil and molecular evidence that dolphins descended from land animals that had 4 legs. And what we see here is a remnant in development of that hind limb beginning to develop. Here it is in a tetrapod which still has its hind, okay, that's the hind limb bud. Tetrapod that still has its limbs and keeps its limbs until adulthood. This is a human embryo at about the same age, 30 days. 4 limb, hind limb bud, see in the same place. This becomes your arms. This becomes your legs. There's one on each side. In the human embryo, this continues to get bigger and forms your arms. This continues to get bigger and form your legs. In the dolphin embryo, that hind limb bud goes away. It starts developing and then it disappears. Okay, so you have to ask yourself, why would a creator make a dolphin embryo that starts to develop legs, but then aborts them at a certain stage of development? It doesn't make any sense under the hypothesis that was going in Darwin's time, which was creationism. It makes sense under the hypothesis that this animal evolved from something that had 4 legs, and it shows the remnants of that ancestry in a certain stage of development. Whoops, but then aborts them before it turns into the dolphin. So these become flippers, and these things go away. Occasionally, however, you have an atavism in a dolphin. A dolphin will be born with hind limbs. Very, very rare. Here's one of them. Turned over. You can see there they are, right there, sticking right out. And if you look at them, they will have the bones of the hind limbs in them. So the genetic information is still there, but it's been repressed by evolution. Okay, that's the hind limbs of the dolphin. Whoops, sorry. Okay. Here's another thing that doesn't make sense. How many of you are aware that babies get hairy at some point in their development? Do you know that? You all were hairy at the age of about 6 months. You develop this thick coat of hair called the lanugo in utero, okay, and then it gets shed before you're born. It just falls off into the embryonic fluid. Unless you're born premature, which this infant was, and then the baby is covered with hair. Fortunately, that hair is shed as well. But you have to ask yourself, if you're a creationist, why would the creator put hair on a human embryo and then get rid of it? I mean, one possible answer is, well, it keeps it warm, right? Well, you know that you don't need to keep warm in the womb because it's thermoregulated at 98.6 in there. You don't need hair. The answer to this question of why we have this is perfectly understood if you realize that we evolved from animals that were hairy, and were born hairy, i.e. apes. We're the naked ape, but we still show our ancestry from hairy apes at this stage of our development, which is the same stage in which embryonic apes develop coats of hair. It's just that we begin to develop it and then we abort it. Okay? If you go upstairs in the MCZ, you will see skeletons of whales and sperm whales, one like this. Next time you do that, or if you just walk over, I'm not sure what the building is, right? Northwest building. Okay. Just look through the windows in there and you'll see 3 skeletons, a killer whale, and 2 other kinds of little whales. And if you look closely, you'll see those things. You'll see 2 little bones hanging down, suspended by wires from the skeleton. They're not part of the skeleton in that they don't serve a structural function. In fact, they're embedded in the muscle. What are they and why are they there? They don't make any sense because they don't seem to have any function. And if you're a creationist, and remember, we're testing 2 hypotheses here, which are still, amongst most of Americans, opposing hypotheses, evolution versus creation. Well, it's because, as I said before, whales evolved from animals that had hind legs. These are the remnants of the hind legs and the pelvis that the whale used to have. So next time you go to a museum and look at a whale skeleton, look for these little bones hanging down from wires, and you'll see right there evidence that only can be explained by evolution. Sometimes there's an atavism. This is a humpback whale that was found by the famous explorer Roy Chapman Andrews back in the 20s or 30s. And sometimes a whale will be born with a couple of feet of legs sticking out right in the right place. And this is when you dissect them, you'll see that bones that are recognizably bones of the legs. You'll see the femur, the tibia, and the tarsus bones. You can see the scale of this. This is about 2 feet long. Okay, how do you explain the fact that whales still have genetic information that enables them to make hind legs? Only evolution, because they evolved from animals that had hind legs. Okay. You can make a further prediction from what we know about genetics and evolution now about what we would expect to see when we sequence the genome of an animal, which has only been possible in the last 20 years or so. When a structure disappears, like the hind legs of the whale, or the hair of the humans, the way evolution does it doesn't just snip out the gene from the DNA saying, okay, I'm going to take away the leg genes now, remove them from the DNA. That's not the way it happens. What happens is those genes get silenced by mutations, and that makes the character disappear. So we can predict that in our genome, or in the genome of many species, we will find genes that no longer function, but that were functional in an ancestor, are no longer useful for that organism evolutionarily, and therefore have been silenced. But the DNA still remains as sort of a silent witness to our ancestry. Now, here's a human embryo again at the age of 4 weeks, and this is one of the silent witnesses that I'll talk about. This is both a vestigial or a non-functional trait and a non-functional gene. Here's the human embryo. So what is this thing here? It's, any of you guess? It's the yolk sac. Okay. We don't have yolk. Chickens have yolks. Reptiles have yolk. We're descended from reptiles way back when. We still form a yolk sac. There's nothing in it. It's as empty as a child's balloon at Park Street. There's nothing in it. And yet we still form it. It has no function. Why do we do that? It's a remnant of what we had when we were reptiles. But now that we can sequence human DNA, and this just appeared, I guess, about a year ago, we find that we have the genes for making the proteins that used to fill up the sac in our DNA. We still have 3 genes to make yolk in the human genome, but they're dead. They've been silenced by mutations. Okay, now how can a creationist answer that question? Why do we have these genes in the first place? Unless at one point they were active in one of our ancestors and have since been silenced. We not only have dead genes for making yolks, we have dead genes for making vitamin C. Humans don't eat vitamin, the reason we need vitamin C, we have to take it in our diet, why sailors get scurvy, is because we can't make it ourselves. But almost every other species of mammal can make vitamin C. We need to get it in our diet. Presumably we got enough of it in our diet when we were apes and fruits and stuff that we didn't need the synthetic pathway for making vitamin C. And so we don't use it anymore. In fact, that pathway is still in our DNA. But the last step in the pathway, the gene that makes the last transition from one molecule to the vitamin C that we need, is dead. Okay, it's gone. And it's inactivated by the very same mutation that inactivates the gene for making vitamin C in gorillas and chimpanzees, which also cannot make vitamin C. Now, how do you explain that? Why would the Creator endow us with a fully fledged biochemical pathway and then wipe it away with a single mutation and yet keep it in our DNA? You cannot explain that in any other way except we have common ancestry with animals. Same with the genes that enable us to smell. We have hundreds of them, but the vast majority of our olfactory receptor genes, and this was a Nobel Prize was awarded for this work several years ago, the vast amount of genes that we have that enable us to smell are dead. We are organisms that rely on our sight and hearing to apprehend our environment, unlike a lot of our ancestors or relatives like cats and dogs. So if you look at the DNA of our genome and compare it to the DNA of a dog or a cat, you'll see that dogs and cats have lots of different genes enabling them to smell different molecules. We have those same genes too, but they're dead. They're inactive. They've been rendered useless by mutations, okay, because we don't need them. So our genome is a graveyard of dead genes that testifies to our ancestry. The last line of evidence for evolution, retrodictions, and again this was made by Darwin in Origin of Species. Much of this evidence was first apprehended by Darwin. The vestigial organs, the embryology, these were all loose facts floating around in the journals of biology that nobody had ever thought to say, well, what does this mean? It only makes sense if, and then the if was the origin of species. And he had 2 chapters in that book on biogeography, which is the distribution of plants and animals on the surface of the planet. Okay? And I don't have time to go over this in great detail, but this is, to me, one of the most compelling bits of arguments for evolution that was made. And Darwin was justly proud of this. He thought that biogeography and embryology, because he didn't have a fossil record then, were the two killer points of evolution. So what are the facts about biogeography? Well, I'll just talk about one area, which is what we see on islands, in particular oceanic islands, which we define as islands that were formed from below the sea and appeared without any life on them. Volcanic islands, for example, like Hawaii or the Galapagos, or coral reef islands like Bermuda. These are known as oceanic islands because when they first appeared, nothing was on them. Those are in contrast to what we call continental islands like Britain and Madagascar and New Zealand, islands that used to be part of continents but then floated away from them due to plate tectonic movement. So here's Lord Howe in the South Pacific. It's a small island, but it's famous because it has lots of endemic species on it. And this is the thing that Darwin noticed, that for oceanic islands that were formed de novo, as opposed to continental islands, they had lots of weird endemic things on them, but they were lacking certain things. And oceanic islands, for example, like Lord Howe, do not have any endemic, which means endemic means found only in that place, mammals, reptiles, amphibian, and freshwater fish. Okay. And this is a general characteristic that Darwin noted. I mean, everybody knew this back then. Well, not everybody knew it, but if you went to the scientific literature, you would see, well, I went to Hawaii and there were no native mammals there. Or I went to the Galapagos and there's no freshwater fish. But those facts have not been collated or put into a synthetic framework. Hawaii has no endemic amphibians, reptiles, mammals, or freshwater fish. Okay, plenty of insects, plenty of plants, plenty of birds, but it lacks these things. Okay, why is that? Same with the Galapagos. The Galapagos has a couple of reptiles. It has the tortoises and this marine iguanas, but it doesn't have any endemic mammals. It doesn't have any endemic amphibians, no endemic freshwater fish. How do you explain that? Continental islands like Great Britain or New Zealand have plenty of these things on them. So there's these major kinds of animals missing from oceanic islands. So how do you explain that if you're a creationist? And the creationist, well, I know the creationist mindset so well that I could pretend I'm one. And they'd say, well, the Lord did not see fit to put these things on the islands because these islands are unsuitable habitat for things like amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and fish. Okay, so how do you test that assertion? Well, it was Darwin who did that. He just observed that when you introduce these things to the islands, they do really well. Here's two of them that did really well in Hawaii. If you've been to Hawaii, the first time I went to Hawaii, this nearly scared the hell out of me. I was driving down the road and this thing ran across a mongoose. And it turned out they had been introduced to control snakes, which had been introduced accidentally, and they were eating all the native birds. And mongoose are doing really well in Hawaii, thank you. And here's another one, an amphibian introduced in Hawaii. It's the cane toad, which you know from the movie The Cane Toad, if you've seen that, has taken over Hawaii. So, as Darwin pointed out, these islands are suitable habitat in many ways for these animals and plants. They just don't occur there. Why is that? Obvious. How could they have gotten there in the first place? And that is the reason why on islands we see plenty of plants, birds, and insects. Plants can float across to a newly formed island, or they can be crapped out by birds. In fact, many island plants are actually crapped out by birds that are flown from the mainland. That's why there are so few trees on islands, because tree seeds are too big for most birds to eat. And birds, of course, can fly to an island. Insects can fly or be blown. So there's plenty of this stuff on the islands. There's so little of that stuff. Darwin pointed out, well, that makes sense if these endemic things that live on islands were descended from things that got there by overwater transport. And it's hard for a mammal, and even harder for a reptile or an amphibian, much less a freshwater fish, to get 600 miles across the ocean to get to the Galapagos. Okay. And the final sort of nail in the coffin on biogeography is if you look at the species on an oceanic island and you look where else in the world are the species that are similar to them, they're on the nearest mainland. And Darwin pointed this out for the Galapagos. If you're standing on the Galapagos, he said, you will feel an affinity with the flora and fauna of the western part of South America. Okay, why is that? Because these animals in the Galapagos descended from the animals in South America, despite the fact, how many of you have been to the Galapagos? Fair number. You know, if you've been there, you know it's nothing like the west coast of South America in terms of habitat. It's dry, rocky, lava habitat with not much water. The west coast of South America is rainforest. It's wet. So it's not a similarity in habitat that makes the animals in the Galapagos resemble those of the South American mainland. It's because they descended from them. It's their ancestors that came over water. Okay, so I dwell into this at some length just to show you, because I've never heard a creationist even try to explain this evidence. They just sort of turn their heads and pretend it doesn't exist. The last prediction of evolution is that we have bad design. Okay, this is if you're my age, then you will be aware of this bad design. Fortunately, I have not yet experienced it, but I know it's going to happen because of this. Well, sorry, because I see this on television every night. And I see men running from their golf carts to the restroom, so I know what's in store for me. If you know the way natural selection works, it takes what's there and modifies it into something else. Okay, so the flippers of the whale come from the front limbs of land-dwelling tetrapods, and that's why they still have separate digits and things. And so you don't expect evolution to result in a perfect design. It's a jerry-rigged process because you're constrained with taking what was there before and going to something new, but every step in that process has to be adaptive because that's how natural selection works. So you predict that organisms are full of bad design. The cliche case is the appendix. I'm not going to talk about that. How many of you have had appendicitis? Okay, so you'd be dead if you lived before surgery. I think 15% of Americans get them. Bad design. Okay, creationists will say, well, it might help the immune system a little bit. It doesn't help the immune system enough to compensate for those 15% of people that would be dead with their appendix. So that's the cliche example, but I like the prostate better because not so many people know about it. Prostate gland, as you probably know, is a gland which, as in males, is next to the bladder. It surrounds the urethra, which is the tube through which urine flows. The prostate gland produces seminal fluid, the fluid that helps the sperm be transmitted down the duct, and it's a gland that surrounds the urethra. Okay. The problem with this design is that this gland is prone to swelling in later age. I won't ask you to raise your hand if this has happened to you, but it will if you're a male, or at least I don't know what the statistics are. I don't want to look them up, but I know they got to be common because it's on TV every night. Okay, so about a certain age, your prostate gland enlarges. When it enlarges, it cuts off the urethra. It squeezes this tube, and you can't urinate, and it's painful. And you all know about this, and that's why you have this stuff. That is a bad design. You do not put an organ prone to swelling around a collapsible tube if you're an intelligent designer. You put it somewhere else. Okay. Robin Williams noted this in one of his movies. I can't remember the name of it. It wasn't one of his better movies where he becomes the president of the United States accidentally. He's asked to pronounce on intelligent design, and he says, intelligent design, just look at the prostate gland. Look how it's designed. It's like running a sewage pipe through a playground, which is in fact what this is. So I could give lots of examples of this, but it's in my book. Buy my book, and you'll read a whole chapter on this stuff. Okay, so, and finally the last prediction, I can't go into this in detail, the one that creationists love to do is, if evolution or adaptation results largely from natural selection, then we should be able to find examples of natural selection operating in nature. In Darwin's time, we didn't have any, really. He used artificial selection, selective breeding, as an analog for natural selection. But we really want to do more than just watch a rose turn into a rose that has more petals or turns a different color. We want to actually see that happening in nature, because artificial selection, although it's a very good analog of natural selection, is mediated by human choice. So we want to see it actually happening. Well, we now have enough cases to show that it is quite common in nature. We've had 300 cases at least that are pretty well known. They're all documented, or at least a lot of them in this book. This is actually old now, in the 70s. We have a lot more cases of natural selection in the wild by John Endler. And the most famous case that you're probably aware of is that of the medium ground finch in the Galapagos, Geospiza fortis, which underwent a drought. The big seeds, juicy seeds that, the juicy small seeds that it used to live on before the drought died. All those plants died. It was forced to deal with big seeds that were tough to crack. And sure enough, the animal evolved. The population underwent a transformation in which its beak got 10% bigger in 1 year. Okay, this is natural selection. That's a lot of evolutionary chains. I mean, if you extrapolate it to like 1,000,000 years, that would have a beak bigger than the moon. Okay, that didn't happen, of course, but I mean, it is a case of evolution that's been well documented. It's described in this book, The Beak of the Finch, by Jonathan Weiner, which won the Pulitzer Prize, deservedly so. Okay, so summing up the evidence for evolution. First of all, we have all these different lines from different areas. We have a fossil record which shows gradualism, change, splitting, and common ancestry. That's 4 out of the 5 requirements for the theory of evolution to be supported. We have the existence of vestigial organs, a completely different field of biology, our appendix, the whale's pelvis. We have these weird quirks of development like the lanugo in humans and the rear limb buds in dolphins. We have the examples of bad design like the prostate gland, our spines, the painful childbirth that human females are forced to endure because of the constraints of their pelvis and our need for big brains. Biogeography, a completely different area of evidence, and examples of natural selection in nature. So we have all this stuff, each of these from a different area of biology. What does that mean? It means that you're perverse if you don't put this stuff together and say that evolution is true. Okay. Now, there are conceivably some facts that could show that evolution was wrong. I've made a list of them. I mean, like all things, evolution is a provisional truth. There are some things that could convince me, at least, that it didn't happen. Now, that we don't have any of that evidence, but I just want to make a list to show you that we're aware that this theory could be falsified. Fossils in the wrong place. I mentioned humans in the Precambrian. If you had an adaptation in one species that was good only for another species, for example, if you found a nipple on a female mole that could only be used to suckle a mouse, if you found something like that, you'd be hard-pressed, because natural selection can't do that. If you found a lot of that, you'd be hard-pressed to think, and I've made all these other examples too, but we haven't found them. We haven't found any of these, so despite 1,000,000 chances for us to find out that evolution was wrong, we haven't found a single one. Evolution always comes up right. And that means, as in any scientific sense as you want to accept, that evolution is true. Okay? So that's the end of the evidence part, but I just want to take a few minutes at the end to talk about why people don't believe it. In the book I describe, I lectured to a group of wealthy businessmen on the North Shore of Chicago who paid me a goodly sum to come up and lecture to their group about the evidence for evolution. And afterwards, one guy came up to me and said, "Well, Dr. Coyne, I found your evidence that you presented, some of it, which I've already presented, was very convincing, but I'm not convinced." Okay? And I scratched my head internally, of course, and thought, well, why would somebody find convincing evidence and not be convinced? In fact, most Americans are not convinced by evolution. This is the belief in evolution has been static for the last 26 years. This is a graph showing the percentage of Americans that accept creationism, young Earth creationism, Earth 6,000 years old, people and everything else poofed into existence, theistic evolution, God-guided evolution. I mean, I don't even know if I count these people as believing in evolution, because they say that, yeah, things evolved, but God changed things here and there. I mean, that's not evolution the way scientists understand it. And then people who believe in evolution the way, or accept evolution the way scientists do, these numbers, they've barely budged, okay, over this period. In this period of 26 years, we have had Carl Sagan, we've had Stephen Jay Gould, we've had Ed Wilson, we've had Richard Dawkins, we've had National Geographic, we've had the animal channels. It's not like people don't know that there's evolution out there, but they still, look at these figures, are flat. And of course you don't, sorry?
Who are the other 6%?
Don't know. Okay. Those are the people that are afraid to say they're creationists. I don't know. That's just a guess. So, I mean, there's a slight and heartening uptick here from 9 to 14%. It's, in absolute terms, it's only a 5% increase, but in real terms, it's 5/9 or 55, 55% change. But really, and my book came out in 2009, but I'm sure you're not going to see a dramatic uptick due to my book. I mean, it's flat. So why is this? We know that evolution has occurred. It's a scientific fact as solid as the fact that there's atoms and that infectious diseases are caused by bacteria. Why is this? Well, you know why it is. Why are we here? Why are we next to the bottom? There's a simple one-word answer which people hate to hear, because although it's true, it's invidious to many people, and that's this, which is religion. The reason why we have opposition to evolution in this country and not in the other countries is because we are an extraordinarily religious nation. In fact, of all first world countries, we are the most religious. Now, it may seem stupid for me to tell you that creationism comes from religion, because you know that. I have never met a creationist in my life who was not motivated by religion. And they'll tell you that. And the churches will say, we don't believe in evolution because it contravenes scriptures. Or Muslims will say it contravenes the Quran. So if you just listen to what people say about evolution, you will know that the opposition that we have to acceptance of evolution is not due to Americans being stupid or being unexposed to the evidence. It's due to the fact that they have another belief system which prevents them from accepting evolution, and that is religion. Now, I know we have a fairly well-off liberal crowd here, and when I debate liberal theologians, I'm surprised at how little they really know about how religious Americans really are. So I want to talk about how religious, very briefly, Americans really are, because that's what's preventing us from understanding evolution. What proportion of people in the United States believe in the literal existence of angels? How many more, can somebody like shout out guesses or something? Whoa, you know the data better than I do. 63%. It goes higher if you go to hell. 70% believe in hell, 70% believe in heaven. I think 70%, well, 92% of Americans say that they believe in God, and about 75% they absolutely believe in God. If you ask them how many accept evolution, and you're being generous here because I'm including theistic evolution, 40%. Okay, these things don't exist. What Darwin said it does exist. Yes. Oh, you can't. Is that a general problem? I'm sorry. I'll move the mic up and try to speak a little louder. Thanks for telling me. Okay, is that better? I'll try to talk louder too. Okay, and if you can't hear that, then you need a hearing aid. Okay, so this is what we're facing. Belief in angels. 63% of the people that you see, not necessarily walking around Harvard Square, but just taking a cross section of American believe in angels. Okay, why is evolution so strongly opposed by religion? Well, you know why it is. First of all, evolution, it doesn't teach this, but it has this philosophical effect on people. It has effective views on origin and on expressionless. We're primates descended from other primates that were sort of hairy and probably walked on their knuckles. We're not the special objects of creation, according to the theory of evolution. We're just one little branch, albeit a big-brained branch, on the tree of life, and we're no more special than a squirrel is. And I always think that to myself when I see the squirrels walking across Harvard Yard. Effective views of purpose and meaning. A lot of people will read evolution as saying, well, we have no purpose. We just descended from inorganic molecules 3.5 billion years ago. Life has no meaning. I'm going to shoot myself if you're Camus or something like that. But I mean, this is true. This is what these people say, and this is what creationists will tell you why they don't like evolution. And finally, its effect on morality. If morality was not handed down by God, then why don't we just behave like beasts? Because we evolved from beasts. Okay. So for these reasons and many others, religion does not like evolution. Unlike any other branch of science, save perhaps cosmology, evolution hits our feeling of solipsism in the solar plexus. It just says we're just highly evolved rotifers, something like that. Okay. Okay, so I mean, I shouldn't have to try to convince people that religion is the cause of anti-evolutionism in America because it's so palpably obvious. But when I do that, there are many people whom I call faitheists who don't necessarily believe in God themselves, but think that religion is a good thing because it keeps the masses down, it keeps them happy. You don't want to diss religion because so many people find it. I mean, I really don't understand it. You can argue with somebody for being a Republican. You can say they're stupid for being a Republican. You shouldn't have these views. And political views are held very deeply as religious views. But if you tell somebody their religious views are wrong, they don't want to hear about it. They call you strident and militant, and there's something wrong with you. So when I say that religion is the cause of anti-evolutionism or anti-science in America in many ways, it's palpably obvious, but I have to convince people. Okay, it's not only the cause of anti-evolutionism in America, it's the cause of anti-evolutionism throughout the world. Here's a graph that I plotted where I took 32 European countries, the same 32 I showed you before, and I simply plotted on the x-axis the degree of belief in God of the inhabitants of each country, from low God to high God beliefs. And it's basically the way they do this, I think, is how often do you pray every day to yourself. That's the index I think they use for this. And then the acceptance of evolution from the graph I showed you before. And you see this strong negative correlation here. These countries up here with high acceptance of evolution, like Denmark, Sweden, etc., have low belief in God. There are countries, believe it or not, where only 20% of the inhabitants believe in God. Look to Scandinavia for those. And then as the countries become more and more religious, the acceptance of Darwinism goes down. This is a highly statistically significant correlation. Where are we? Right there. Highly religious. There's Turkey, only below us. We're highly religious, 80% here, the answer to this question, and low acceptance of evolution, about 40%. Okay, so what does this mean? You can interpret this kind of correlation in several ways. I'm almost done here, by the way. First of all, you could say, well, if it's just these two factors affecting each other, maybe the more you accept evolution going up here, the less likely you are to be religious. That is, learning about evolution turns you into an atheist, okay? And certainly for some people that's true. I think that happened to Darwin, for example. And certainly people who go into evolution, eventually, a lot of them, their religious belief tends to be eroded. But I think the main reason for this correlation is the other one. In fact, I know it's the other one. It's that belief in God prevents you. It puts a mental wall up between you and accepting the facts of evolution. Why do I know this? Well, I'll give you a statistic in a minute. But many people get their religion. In fact, everybody gets their religion before they get their Darwin. So those barriers to accepting evolution are instilled in you by your parents or your peers or your church before you get to understand evolution, and they prevent you from understanding it. So I think, and there's possibly an uncorrelated third variable here. In fact, I know there is, but this shows you that I think that acceptance of religion is a palpable and important force in blocking acceptance of evolution. What it means, of course, is that me standing up here and telling you about the vestigial bones of the whale is not going to do crap, right? Because if you are determined by your faith not to believe that, then no matter what I tell you, you're not going to. And here's some proof for it. This is a Time magazine poll taken in 2006 that generally asked Americans, if science found a fact that contradicted the tenets of your faith, what would you do? So you have a choice. You accept the fact, despite the fact that it contravenes your religion. You accept your faith and deny the fact. In other words, you're perverse. Or you get cognitive dissonance. Okay, so here's the answer. What percentage of Americans would reject the fact in favor of their faith? What is your guess of what that? How many? You people are really cynical. In fact, it's 64%. Okay, but look, that's a frightening figure. 64% of Americans will reject a scientific fact if it goes against the dictates of their faith. If this doesn't tell you why evolution is not accepted in America, because the Bible tells you that evolution didn't occur, then I don't know what does. Okay. So what's the conclusion from this? Well, if you want people to accept the fact, the sort of conclusion that you would draw is, well, you got to get them to reject their faith. In other words, get rid of religion. A famous professor told me the other day, if I had my way, I would shoot everybody in this country that's religious. I won't name him/her, because you'd have to wear a Kevlar vest, or she would have to wear a Kevlar vest. But it is the fact that I think that the root, what this mandates is that if we really want evolution to be accepted by Americans, we have to loosen the grip of religion on their minds. At least those forms of religion, not all forms of religion, but those forms of religion that make people resistant to evolution. And it's not just fundamentalists. 29% of Catholics, which is a faith that's officially designated as accepting evolution because the Pope said evolution is okay. 29% of Catholics are young Earth creationists. Okay, so it's not just the fundamentalists. It's religion in general, even those so-called mainstream or even liberal faiths. People just don't like it because it doesn't make them feel special. Okay, so how do we get rid of religion, if you want to do that? Yeah, I don't advocate shooting people that are religious. That's a violation of the First Amendment. I believe in persuasion, but I don't think you can just do it by saying, well, your faith is foolish. Because there are reasons why people are religious. There are reasons why Americans are more religious than other countries. We're not dumber than Swedes or Danes, so why are we more religious than Swedes or Danes? And I think the answer is that America is a far more dysfunctional society That may strike you as something that's incongruous, but a far more dysfunctional society than Sweden or Denmark. There's a lot of work coming out in sociology now which shows that in many ways our society, compared to those societies that are A, less religious, and B, more accepting of evolution, our society is dysfunctional in ways that will make people become religious. Here's one paper from last year by Solt et al., which just, you don't have to look at the data, but these are 12 different indices of religion across 71 countries of the world. Each point is a separate country, and these indices of religion on the y-axis or the vertical axis are plotted against the Gini index, which is an index of income inequality. And in every case, there's a highly significant correlation. Those nations in which there's more income inequality are those nations who are more religious. Okay. And you might wonder, well, why is that? Karl Marx had the answer to that. But I don't consider myself a Marxist, but I think he was right about one thing. Not just one thing, but this thing in particular. And you can show it in a better way. This is why Greg Paul, some of you may know of his work, a sociologist, he calculated for 17 first world countries. They were labeled by letters here, and I think Japan's on here as well, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Ireland, Great Britain, etc. He took for each of these countries a measure of how healthy their society was, and he calls this a successful society scale. And it combines things like availability of medical care, infant mortality, corruption, drug usage, venereal disease, income inequality, other indices which sociologists take as being indicative of an unhealthy society, and combine them into what he called the successful society scale, which goes from 0 to a really bad society to 10, a really healthy society. And then for each of these 17 countries, he plotted how successful their societies were, how high they are in the scale, with what proportion of the people believed in God in those countries. That's the correlation. It's a pretty strong correlation, and it's highly statistically significant. The more inhabitants of a country believe in God, the less successful their society is, and vice versa. There we are. We have the highest religious belief and the least successful society. We're pretty well off compared to some of these places, but we have huge degrees of income inequality. We don't have good health care. We have high child mortality. We have too many people incarcerated. If you combine those into this supposedly objective index, we're down pretty low. So there's a negative correlation between religious belief and how successful your society is. Okay, now why is that? So we have a complicating factor here. America's religious, we're religious, and that makes us reject evolution. But why are we religious as religious? Because at least according to sociological theory, we're dysfunctional. And why is that? Why do we get this correlation? Well, there's two ways to explain this. First, you can say, well, the more people that get rid of Darwin for the time. The more people that believe in God, the less successful your society is, because religious people make their societies less successful. Now, you can make stories about that, about the Taliban. You can make stories about Republicans, for example, things like that. Yeah, you can see my political affiliations. It's too late for me to hide them in this talk. But I don't think that's the reason for this. I think that the reason, and the sociologists who do these correlations think that the reason is that, and of course Marx thought the reason was as well, that if you live in a society which is basically dysfunctional and unhealthy, and you see people doing better than you, and you can't go to the doctor and get medical care, and there's corruption and a lot of people are in jail, you need solace and support somewhere. If you can't get it from your society, you get it from the man in the sky. Religion is the opiate of the masses, the sigh of an oppressed people. Okay, so the ultimate conclusion, and this is the end of my tale about evolution, we're a long way from hind limbs and horses here, but I've taught evolution for 30 years, and I just got frustrated by not being able to make headway in the education of many people. The thing that blocks American acceptance of evolution is religion. I firmly believe that, because there is no such thing as a non-religious creationist. You can have religions without creationism. You do not have creationism in the world anywhere without religion. The conclusion that is, we are not going to make headway in getting people to accept evolution in this country until we become less religious. Now you're going to say, religion's here to stay. Can't happen. My answer to that is 2 words: Sweden, Denmark. Okay. 300 years ago, deeply religious societies. Most of Europe was. Most of Europe now is far less religious than America. It can be done. Okay. So, if you want people to accept Darwin, the conclusion is, make them less religious. How do you make them less religious? You don't go saying your religion is stupid. You create a kind of society in which religion is no longer needed as a form of solace. You create a society which is more just, which is more equal, and which is more caring. And regardless of how you feel about religion, I think that that's one goal that all of us can agree on. Thanks very much.
Jerry started off as a fairly straightforward population
geneticist. How you doing, Dan?
Oh, just fine. Thanks for the call.
Good. Well, I really appreciate the chance to talk with you and discuss some things. I'm looking forward to just hearing about your testimony and your book and asking you some questions about creation and prophecy and just hearing what you have to say.
Well, good.
All right. Well, let's start off by, I really am interested in hearing about your book. Why you wrote it and what it's about. So can you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, the book is called Losing Faith in Faith, From Preacher to Atheist. It's a 1992 book, and it tells the story of my deconversion from fundamentalist evangelical Christian minister to an atheist. And I preached the gospel for 19 years. I started preaching in high school. That's why it stretched out so long. And I started soul winning in high school, carrying my Bible to school and preaching in parks and churches, playing the piano, you know. There's all these opportunities in Southern California for ministry back in the 60s and 70s.
Oh, yeah.
And I was a missionary to Mexico for 2 years as an evangelical missionary. I was an associate minister in 3 different California churches, Friends Church and Assembly of God, and then an interdenominational Christian church. And I was a cross-country evangelist, living by faith, no real income, no address even. All our stuff was in storage. I traveled from church to church preaching the gospel, and only living by love offerings, that kind of thing. And then I became a Christian songwriter. A Christian publisher named Man of Music took one of my musicals and published it, and it became for them a bestseller for a while. And I had a couple of sequels, and I started getting invited to do a lot of ministry as like a guest composer, guest conductor, music ministry. So I traveled the country in all sorts of churches, preaching and singing and spreading the gospel, mainly as a soul winner, you know. I viewed myself as a soldier in the army of Christ on the front lines. Come what may, I thought the world was going to end soon, that Jesus was returning soon, and that we needed to get people born again, confess their sins, accept Jesus into their heart as their personal Savior, and all of that. And, the Bible says, by their fruits ye shall know them, and my ministry exhibited all of those fruits of the Spirit. Of course, I was humble enough to say that it wasn't me; it was the Holy Spirit doing it. But you can evaluate a person's ministry based on factors like that, their sincerity. And I was sincere. I believed. I was not a phony. I lived the Christian life. I was a doer of the Word and not a hearer only. I preached from every book of the Bible over many years. I translated much of the New Testament from the Greek. I'm not a great Greek scholar, but I can read it in the Greek with a good lexicon.
Okay.
So I know a lot about Christianity.
So your book is basically a testimony of your past and your deconversion?
Yeah, and then why I changed my mind, and why I'm doing what I'm doing today. So, and there's about half the book is also some analysis, some investigations of the Bible, the discrepancies, some problems in apologetics and that kind of thing.
So did you ever go to a Bible school or college?
Yes, I went to Azusa Pacific University for 4 years. I got a degree in religion.
Oh, okay.
And that's where
I'm familiar with Azusa.
It was called Azusa Pacific College back then, but then when I got my degree, it was a university. And we had a good cross-section of, a Bible college isn't necessarily known for its scholarship, but it was a good Bible college.
Yeah.
A Christian liberal arts university. And then a little bit of apologetics and Christian evidences, and that's where I took those years of Greek study. It was New Testament Greek, not classical Greek. And then I was ordained to the ministry by a church in Central California.
Which one was that?
It was called, at the time it was called Standard Community Christian Center. It was originally part of the Christian church, the Disciples of Christ, but they became independent charismatic church, if you know what that is.
I know charismatic. I can imagine what independence is, I guess.
Well, because the church didn't toe the denominational line, they decided to break off and become their own. And that happens all the time.
Right.
You can't name a church in Christianity that isn't a split off of something, somewhere. That's just part of the healthy part of the Christian experience.
Yeah, but usually also the differences can be very small as far as like sprinkling or immersion for baptism or just issues like that.
Well, I know a guy, he's also a former Church of Christ minister, Farrell Till, and he said that the Church of Christ had a split over whether or not the communion cup should have a handle.
Oh, wow.
They really did. And
wow.
I mean, people who believe the Bible really seriously, they'll it's got to be literal or not, and they're not going to fellowship with other Christians who don't have the exact.
Wow.
It's a kind of intolerance that all religions have, not just Christianity. Whenever you think you have the one true way, there's this kind of.
Well, it's interesting that God does give us the liberty to decide on these little matters and not kill each other all in the same specific camp, but kind of have our own churches where people can worship and.
Well, it's interesting that all of these churches, what are there 1,200 denominations in the United States? They all will claim that God has given to them the correct interpretation, and all the others are a little bit off in some way. And as you pointed out, there have been a lot of intolerances and wars fought over this. And each one will open the Bible and prove to you with their Bible, if they interpret it their way, they'll prove to you that they are right. And they can all do that.
I know that would seemingly be something that would go to the side of an atheist to show, hey, if there's 1,200 interpretations and there's one God, one Holy Spirit, where's the rub? How could this be? I guess from a Christian perspective, they would say, since the fall and since sin came into the world, the devil and powers of darkness, such as demons and things, do tempt and cloud vision and destroy the truth. And
everybody's vision but yours, right?
Well, I guess everyone's vision but God's.
Yeah, everyone says they have God, right? They all say it.
Yeah, I can't say that I'm perfect and everything I know is perfect, but I think what we're talking about here is non-essentials. The essential things of salvation are agreed upon by the vast majority of the denominations. That's Christ's deity, dying on the cross for our sins, the nature of God, those essentials for salvation.
Well, you're describing the essentials of evangelical churches. There are a lot of middle or liberal churches that don't buy into those essentials. But yeah, you're describing a kind of evangelical fundamentalist, because you would be critical of liberal Christians probably who would say that unification, not the unificationists, but the universalists who think there is no hell and that we're all going to be saved. Obviously, you're going to have to draw your line somewhere. And everybody thinks they're drawing the line in the right place. I used to think it. I used to think all these other people had this proclivity to error, to being deceived in some way, but not me. Not me, of course. I mean, I'm a part of the same human race they are, but somehow I was blessed. I was special. I was somehow a little bit above all these other wrong-headed Christians, or else I was lucky enough to be born into the right family.
Well, the core message of the Bible, I think, could probably be understood by a first grader, second grader. It's really not that difficult to see the plan that God has laid out for us in the Bible.
I don't know. I wouldn't want to show it to my first grader. I mean, it's a pretty ugly book when you look at it. And it's a real demeaning book to human nature. And the whole concept of salvation, the whole idea that there needs to be a salvation, is a real insult to humanity. In other words, we are all deserving of damnation. We're no good. We can't think. We can't figure it out. We all have to bow like humble slaves before this master who tells us what is right and wrong, who has expressed his grace to us, how lucky we are that he died and given his free gift to us so that we can avoid this punishment that we all deserve. I mean, that really is an ultimate insult that cuts to the core of what it means to be human. And it could be a self-fulfilling prophecy. You raise kids to think that, oh, I'm a sinner, I might go to hell, that's horrible, I'm no good, I need to surrender. Well, I mean, a lot of people grow up with this attitude that they are no good and that they are sinners, and they act it out.
Mm. Well, I see what you're saying, and I think it's interesting. I think it comes back to sin and how, I don't know, of course you wouldn't believe in original sin, but how that has permeated things to the point where we need God's help and we need His
What do you mean
salvation.
sin? What is sin?
Well, sin, you think can mean different things to different people, but sin is basically violating God's laws, or if, for argument's sake, we could call sin, murder, rape, bestiality, and we can name a few sins just to say, okay, these are things that are wrong. It's not.
Well, is it a sin to do work on the Sabbath? God's law clearly says that anybody who does work on the Sabbath should be put to death. Is that a sin?
Well, that scripture was a specific law for. See, when you read the Bible, obviously you need to take it into context. Who is it talking to? Why is it saying what it's saying? I think you're quoting an Old Testament law that was given to the Jews. Isn't that right?
It's the Ten Commandments. Honor the Sabbath day to keep it holy. The Sabbath day is part of the Ten Commandments that almost every Christian church views as core to Christian theology.
Okay, well, I believe it is important to take off a day during the week to rest, but interestingly, that is the one commandment that was not repeated in the New Testament. Did you know that?
Well, okay, so then you're throwing out part of the Old Testament. Christians are free to pick and choose what they like and don't, right?
No, I'm not throwing out anything, but some of the Bible is historical narrative, some of it is poetry, some of it is theology, and the section that you just grabbed, I believe, was a section that was a law for the Jews.
Well, all the Ten Commandments were a law for the Jews, so...
Absolutely.
So what I'm trying to say is, if a sin is violating God's law, then a sin can be anything, even if humanity thinks it's something good.
Mm-hmm.
This religion declares that their God says it's something wrong, then it's a sin. So it's a relative thing. It's a circular argument. I think there's no such thing as sin.
Mm-hmm.
There are actions that some human beings who are not completely healthy might commit that cause unnecessary harm.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have systems of justice, and we might call them crimes. We have a prison system. We protect ourselves. But to call it sin is to strike at the core of what it means to be a human being, and is a deep insult to humanity. There's no such thing as sin, and we don't need salvation.
Well, sin is in the dictionary. It's a term that is used by millions of people.
Yes, so is the word ghost. I mean, there's a lot of words that people use, but it doesn't mean it points to a reality.
Okay. Well, ghost is a word that, we can read the dictionary definition of ghost, and I'm sure it would say something to the effect of, supernatural. It could be imagined, but sin is more of a concrete definition of a trespass or a wrongdoing. But you don't have to admit that sin exists. So your definition of sin shows that something exists that is wrong.
I don't define sin. I throw the word out. We don't even need it. We do have we can, as secular human beings, describe morality and ethics based on what our human needs are, and not have to make it some kind of a religious thing. In fact, millions of good Americans live really good, charitable, happy, meaningful lives without this concept of sin and salvation. But they are good people because they respect humanity and other life on this planet by trying to avoid unnecessary harm. Calling it a sin makes it into something, above our experience. It makes it something non-human, and therefore very dangerous.
Don't you think that it makes things kind of subjective if we don't have a non-subjective authority, supernatural authority from outside of our time, space dimension?
That's the only way to be moral. In fact, making it non-subjective or absolute is very, very dangerous. If there is supposedly this absolute morality, these principles that have to be absolutely followed, that were decreed by this God, then why is it that no two Bible-believing why is it that there are no two issues on which Bible-believing Christians agree? Take any crucial social issue of the day, abortion rights, or the death penalty, or doctor-assisted suicide, or gay rights, you name it. You go down through a dozen very important things. You'll find good Christians who pray, who go to church, who read the Bible, who seek God's guidance. You will find them falling on different sides of those issues. There is no clear, absolute moral statement within the body of Christ, which is one of the evidences that Christian morality really is non-existent. It still boils down to your subjective feeling of what you think about abortion or what you think about gay rights. There's no verse in the Bible that says, "Thou shalt not commit abortion." It's Christians themselves making a subjective decision what they think the Bible ought to be saying.
Well, when you say we need to differentiate between morality and what the Bible says, because there's always going to be immorality in the world, just because someone believes in God or reads the Bible, it doesn't necessarily make them a moral person just by reading. But as far as abortion is concerned, there's many scriptures, and I have some of those on my website at jcsm.org that talk about God is the creator of life. He forms us in the womb. He's the giver and the taker of life. I mean, those would go to show things about abortion and even about suicide also.
Well, sure. You can always find verses in the Bible to support your opinion. There are Christians on the other side, and you know it. There are good Christians on the other side who support abortion rights, and they take the Bible and they look at other verses and they interpret it another way. I mean, some of them point out that the Bible is very anti-child. That verse in Psalms where God said, "You should be happy to take the little children and dash them against the stones," which is very anti-life. There's all sorts of disrespect.
Do you know what context that was in? That verse?
Yeah, that was Psalm 137, verse 9. That's where the Babylonians are supposed to be put down, and the followers of God should be happy to take the little ones, the little children, which, I mean, you have to agree that those children are innocent. You'd be happy to take them and dash them against the stones. It doesn't say you should regrettably do it. It says you should be happy or blessed to take the children of these infidel Babylonians and dash them against the rocks. You can go through the entire Bible and find all sorts of a horrible disrespect for human life for people that supposedly were worshiping the wrong religion. They didn't follow the Jews' pet religion, and so they should be exterminated, killed, wiped out. Oh, except you can save the young virgin girls for yourself, the Bible says in Numbers. Save the young virgin girls and divide them up as part of the war booty. They even called it war booty. Kill all the women who have known men, kill all the men and the boys, but save the young virgins for yourself as a part of the prize. And 32 of the virgins go to the priests. I mean, it really is a brutal book, and the God of that book is not somebody I would respect very much if he lived in my country.
Well, there's a couple of reasons why in the Old Testament God did deliver enemies into the Israelites' hands. First, the first battle that the Israelites fought, they were attacked by coming through another person's land. And furthermore, there's two big reasons why God wanted their line to remain pure, why he didn't want them to interbreed with the other people, and why he plainly said, destroy these people, every one of them. And one reason is because Jesus was supposed to come through the bloodline there. And the bigger reason is that the Nephilim, which were the fallen angels, had come down and had sex with the women, which you can see in Genesis 6 and you can see later. And they produced this demonic hybrid offspring. And that's why God destroyed the earth with the flood. It's because they had all these demonic offspring. And when God's saying in the Old Testament, destroy this whole entire people, you have to understand that these people were contaminated. That's why they said that Noah's line was pure, because Noah had not intermingled with these demons. And we could see the demons doing it again because we see giants in the Old Testament again, like with Goliath and stuff. He was a Nephilim offspring. I'm sure you've studied that word, right?
Yeah, I know what that is. The sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair. I know that. And but Jason, are you telling me this with a straight face? I mean, do you really sincerely believe this stuff about the angels coming down and having sex with human beings? That's a myth.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's part of the Bible that is legendary and mythical. You don't really believe that happened, do you?
Well, it's compounded again in Jude, and yes, absolutely.
You do.
Scriptures say it.
You actually believe that some angelic creatures came down from heaven and I mean, this is the 21st century, Jason. You're an adult. You're talking about devils and angels and demons, and think about what you're saying and how ludicrous this appears to an intelligent person. I mean, that stuff did not happen. Those are myths that the Israelites made up to try to explain in their own bumbling way what they thought the origins of the world was like. Besides that, the fallacy of your argument, if the race was purified at Noah, the verse I just quoted to you came after Noah, the Babylonians, and the race that supposedly produced Jesus never was pure. In fact, your argument amounts to racism. You shouldn't interbreed with these other races. We should have one pure, high Aryan race, or whatever you want to call the race, Jewish race, which is despicable. Who would have any honor to hold such a book under their arm?
Well, I think you really have to live in a box to not see any supernatural activity in the world today, which is, predominantly an atheistic viewpoint that there's nothing supernatural.
For example?
When you have demon-possessed people, You have psychic readers. You have people calling people from the dead. You have all kinds of supernatural things in the world.
When has that been proved or confirmed? I mean, if those things really happen, Jason, I mean, if you are right, every scientist, every medical person in the world would jump at a chance to prove that you could win the Nobel Prize if you discovered a hitherto unknown force in the universe. Anyone and everyone with even the smallest amount of intelligence would be jumping on that to prove it, to show what science and what the world is really like. But you should know, just as much as I do, that none of those anecdotes have ever been confirmed. As soon as you scratch under the surface, you find exaggerations or outright fraud or misinterpretations of natural events. You don't find supernatural miracles. And if you did find one, Jason, you should win the Nobel Prize for proving it to the world.
Well, I don't think there's a couple of reasons why I think that's a little flawed. One is I don't think there's Christians that are really trying to win the Nobel Prize. And two, I think that a lot of times scientists aren't present when miracles are done, when demons are cast out.
How convenient, you know. They just don't happen to be there to see it.
Yeah.
Doesn't the Bible tell you...
These people aren't there to see a lot of things that they still believe. I mean, even atheists have some faith in some things that they haven't seen, they haven't proven. They haven't met Einstein. They haven't met Caesar. You know, they still believe in these people, these things.
Yeah, but when an atheist like me says, I accept the historical existence of Einstein, I'm saying it conditionally. I'm not saying it's the absolute truth. I'm saying I might be wrong. I'm not standing proclaiming that my belief in the existence of Shakespeare is somehow absolute truth. I'd be happy for you to prove me wrong. I'm just saying contingently, based upon what we happen to know and based on our pretty proven methods of history, we can say with a high degree of certainty that these people existed. That's quite different from religious faith that claims 100% absolute certainty, when the whole idea of faith itself implies doubt.
Well, I think it's the faith that comes from reading the Word.
I've read the Word as much as you have.
I don't doubt that you have. Do you think that it takes blind faith, or would you call it, I like to call it informed faith, because I don't feel like I just have a blind, empty faith. I feel like my faith is based on the concepts in God's Word.
But why faith in the first place? I mean, what good is the concept? Why even put that word out in front of you to say we should have blind faith or informed faith? Why not just say use your mind and use your free mind to examine and decide for yourself whether you think this is true or false? What does faith have? In fact, when you use the word faith, you're admitting that the assertions that you are accepting by faith cannot be accepted on their own merits. You need something extra. You need something above and beyond the evidence to make it true. Anytime someone uses the word faith, it's a cop-out. They're admitting defeat. Faith is a kind of agnosticism, because if you knew it was true, you wouldn't need faith.
Well, these are real humanistic principles. You know, there is no sin. You know, you do not need to have faith. It's really the antithesis of what God's Word is saying.
Exactly, and I'm proud of that. I mean, that's a good thing, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, and you're free to accept that view, but I just feel that there's so much compelling evidence to the contrary that,
for example,
really, well, you know, you call them bumbling Jews and stuff, but these bumbling Jews have these prophecies in the Old Testament that have been fulfilled that really, I mean, I would like to know what you think about them.
Well, give me one example then.
Oh, okay. There's over 60 messianic prophecies.
Well, give me one.
One of them, okay, how about Genesis 17:19, where, see, what God did is that He continually told the Jews where Jesus was going to come from, and He would narrow down the bloodline, narrow, to say, okay, it's going to come through the tribe of Jesse, the tribe of David, Jacob, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in the New Testament, we see His lineage, and that's exactly where He came from. Numbers 24:17.
Wait a minute. I'm reading Genesis 17:19 right now.
Okay.
God said, "No, but your wife Sarah shall bear you a son, and you shall name him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him."
Okay.
Where does that say anything about Jesus or the Messiah? Where does that say anything at all about Christianity? This is a covenant between God and, this is a covenant that these religious people wrote between their God and themselves, right? Where's this Messiah and Jesus dying on the cross? Why is that a prophecy?
Okay, well, if you want to see more about the cross and the Messiah, you know, there's other passages.
But I want to know why that verse is a prophecy. You mentioned that verse, and you said it was an example of a prophecy. Why is it a prophecy?
That verse is a prophecy because it says that I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant. This wasn't just a temporary covenant.
But what did he predict? What's the prophecy?
He prophesied that. See, we can see over in Luke 3:34 where Jesus came from, the son of Jacob, son of Isaac. Jesus was the one that fulfilled this prophecy by having an everlasting covenant with God.
That's just saying Jesus was a Jew. I mean, because all Jews could say they were from that line, basically.
Up until about 70 A.D. they could, and then after that it was impossible to trace their line because they all were scattered all over the place.
But why do you think Genesis 17:19 is a prophecy? Because the New Testament writer thought it was? Where does it say here? Here is a prophecy. The Messiah will be born, and his name will be Jesus. Where does it say that in the Old Testament?
Well, I don't know if it has a prophecy that you're looking for in the Old Testament.
It seems very, very vague. It seems like the kind of thing that a New Testament writer would be digging around to try to say, aha, we can make this verse fit our theology.
Why
and they're
would
very
Luke do
vague.
that?
Because they had a religious agenda. These New Testament writers admit it. These things are written that you might believe, right? They had an agenda to promote their theology over all these other competing theologies, and even within Christianity, different New Testament writers. So they looked back to the Old Testament, and they found these quote-unquote prophecies that quote-unquote predicted what was going to happen. But when you look at the actual prophecies themselves, you scratch beneath the surface, they're not really prophecies at all about anything at all. The later Christian writers are rewriting history. Show me a real prophecy.
There's hundreds of them, and we'll talk about some more of them.
Well, give me another example then.
First, are you admitting that you believe that there was a man named Jesus and the apostles did all exist?
I am saying that I admit that there was an early Christian community who may or may not have been based on a man named Jesus, and it's irrelevant. If there was a Jesus, which there may have been, he certainly was not the Son of God, and he certainly was not a perfect teacher or a very admirable teacher either. But I do agree that there was an early Christian community because you have to explain the existence of those Christian writings, and not just Christian writings, but other religious sect writings as well. So yeah.
Okay, and I think it's also well known that the apostles, all of them except for one or two who were exiled, died terrible deaths.
No, that's not well known. How do you know that? How do you know that?
Fox's Book of Martyrs. It's just tradition.
Tradition. You know, these books were written like in the 2nd and 3rd and 4th centuries after Christianity, pretending to know how the disciples lived. There's a paradox here. Think about it. Jesus, if he lived, died around the year 30, 28, 29, or 30, because he was born in the year 4 BC. So if he lived, he died around the year 30. His disciples would have been what?
I think 32 is actually the date that I've come up with.
Well, it can't be that late. It's probably around the year 30. So the disciples would have been what, in their mid-20s or 30 or so? The average life expectancy in Rome, in Roman times in that part of the country, was about 45 years old. So if these guys were all martyred in their lives for preaching Christianity, how did any of them live long enough to write the Gospels in the years 80 and 90?
How did you know that's the life expectancy in Rome at that time?
Because I have a friend, Richard Carrier, who's an expert on early Roman history, and I asked him specifically what was the life expectancy of human beings in that time. And he gave me an actuarial chart that shows what it would have been. So if any of them lived past the year 60, that would have been really good luck. But you're saying they were all martyred, right? But we know that the Gospels were written in the years 70, 80s, and 90s, and maybe even later. So you're imagining that these disciples who all died horrible deaths somehow lived into their 90s to write these Gospels. There's a contradiction there, and obviously whoever wrote the Gospels, many of them didn't even know Jesus and were not part of that original following.
Well, why do you think the Gospels were written at such a late date?
Well, because there was an early Christian church. They didn't call themselves Christians right away, but there was an early church, a Jewish sect that thought they had a Messiah. And as the second and third generations came along, they were trying to preserve their histories, and they wrote and edited and rewrote and borrowed and redacted. And they started getting in fights and controversies, and so they were starting to write down, my gospel says this is what happened, and mine says this is what happened. And you can see why the gospels all contradict each other, because they're all writing kind of shooting from the hip, basically. And
I don't see any meaningful contradictions in the gospels at all.
Oh, you don't? Well, that's what I used to preach, Jason. But in my book, I detail many, many, many contradictions that have never been answered. And why would there not be contradictions? Were these were these writers exempt? I mean, were they special people in some way? Human beings today make mistakes. Why were they exempt from making mistakes back in those days? They made lots of them.
I guess the common theory is that if God could make the universe, then God could write a book, or write a book through these people. You
Yeah,
want
right.
to give me an example of a contradiction or two that's from the New Testament?
Sure, I will. Well, I have probably about 40 really good ones, but let's say Acts 7:9 and Acts 9. Did Paul's men hear a voice? Is that Acts 9:7?
Acts 9:7.
Look up Acts 9:7. Not in the NIV, by the way. Are you using the NIV?
I usually use the New King James, the King James.
Yeah, the NIV is really bad. I mean, the NIV should, they should pay a fine. They've mistranslated a whole bunch of the Bible. Acts 9:7. Here's my NRSV. Says, the men who were traveling with Paul stood speechless because they heard the voice but saw no one. Right?
Okay.
Then Acts, is it 22:9? See if my memory's any good. Acts 22:9. Paul is telling the story. Now those who were with me saw the light, but did not hear the voice of the one who was speaking to me. So Acts 9:7 says they heard the voice, but Paul says, nope, you got it wrong, Luke. They did hear the voice. And there's another verse later in Acts, and I can't remember exactly. Actually, that story is told 3 times. That's just one little example of many, many contradictions in the Bible. And people try to say, well, it means they heard and they didn't understand. I wrote an entire column about that. And to this date, there are no quick answers to contradictions like that. I know you think you can provide one, so we should give you a chance to.
Okay, Acts 9:7 and Acts 22:9. I just got a chance to look them up here. Acts 22:9. Okay, so we're talking about, the 2 scriptures are talking about the voice that Saul heard when he was on the road to Damascus?
Exactly.
Okay. And one verse in Acts.
The men who were traveling heard the voice, but saw no one. But in 22:9, they did not hear the voice. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that's obviously you have to admit, at least at face value, that's a contradiction, right? They heard the voice, they did not hear the voice.
Well, the first thing that came to my mind, and I need to investigate this passage more before I can give you an official statement, but the logical thing is that at first Paul thought that these people did not hear the voice, and then later on, after confirmation, he realized that they did, or vice versa. I'm sorry, I finally got the scriptures mixed up. This is the first time that I've investigated this claim.
Yeah, well, you should take more time than this. You shouldn't wing it on the air. But obviously one of them was wrong then, because Luke says they did not hear the voice, and Paul said they did. So one of them, however you explain it, somebody's wrong somewhere.
So you're saying one of these accounts is from Paul and one account is from Luke? They're 2 different accounts?
Well, yeah, because see, Luke wrote the book of Acts, right? And he's in his own voice in chapter 9. But in chapter 22, he's quoting Paul, right? So, and these are Paul's words. Supposedly, we can supposedly assume that Luke knew Paul enough to quote him correctly. Maybe Luke got the quote wrong, in which case you have a different kind of imperfection in the Bible. But see, that's just one. In my book, I detail dozens and dozens of maybe more important ones than these, to show that these were just guys. I mean, they were just people doing their best, and of course they were going to make mistakes. Of course, I mean, you get a bunch of people today to try to write a book, they're going to goof somewhere. I mean, what are we attributing superhuman abilities to these gospel writers? They're just telling it in their own words, and of course they're going to blow it. We can't give them 100% credibility.
Well, yeah, I'd like to check out your book. It sounds pretty interesting if it documents these kinds of things. And I've been meaning to put together a refute of something called the Skeptic's Annotated Bible.
Oh, yeah, I know that guy. He's out of Idaho. Idaho.
Yeah, he has a large site about different Bible problems or contradictions, and I've read some of them, but I think it would be a great ministry tool if I could take the time. It would probably take many hours.
Well, it would be, Jason, if you could do that, but let me ask you something. Why do you think, a priori, that all of these contradictions can be explained? Are you committed to something that you can't possibly have known before the fact? You're taking a doctrinal position or an ideological position that the Bible must not be discrepant, therefore it cannot be, therefore I will find answers. Is that your attitude? Or are you going to the Bible with an open mind thinking, I'm going to find what I find even if I don't like what I find?
Well, I suppose it's for the same reason that I created my internet forum. An atheist found me on the internet in April, And I started talking to him about Christ. He invited me to Reggie Finley's show. So I talked on there about atheism and Christianity, prophecy, creation, all different issues. Then I went into their forum for a while and started talking to them. And I actually got mistreated quite a bit, cursed at and things. So I said, I'm going to make my own forum, and I'm going to invite everybody over here. I'm going to moderate. People will be treated right. And
well, that's good. I support that. I think we need more forums like yours and more people like you. But my question was, why do you think a priori that the Bible must not and cannot have any contradictions? Where did you get that idea?
I know, I'm getting to that. I was also, I created the forum with this thought in mind that, excuse me, that there were answers to these questions, and if there weren't, then I would discover that also. I posted over 1,500 messages on this forum, and all these atheists, there's 100 members in there right now. They post things that are seemingly, unanswerable, and all it does is take maybe half an hour of time. Sometimes it takes 30 seconds, 2 minutes of time. Sometimes it takes a couple hours, but there are answers, and it's ground that has been traveled. And if I come across just a stumper that I can't answer, then I guess that would put into question the Word of God.
But it wouldn't question your faith. There are millions of good Christians who accept the fact that the Bible has contradictions, but it doesn't hurt their faith in God. They realize that it was written by human beings, and so they dig through it to find the gems, and they're not committed in advance to inerrancy. You know what I mean? It's like fundamentalist mindset has to be black and white. But there's a lot of good Christians who don't care as much as you maybe. I'm just wondering why you would think in advance that the Bible must not have contradictions in it. I used to think the same thing, and it's funny how when you put on a different pair of glasses, you go, "Oh, I see where I was wrong. I was coming at it with this attitude that I was unwarranted in the first place."
Well, the biggest authenticator of Scripture to me, and even above my own experience, which would have to be prophecy.
Well, you gave me a really bad example. Give me a better one then.
Okay, I'm sorry if that was a bad example. I've got hundreds literally right here at my fingertips.
Well, give me another example of a clear prophecy, that predicted the future.
Okay, I have a lot of messianic ones, but let's step aside from the messianic ones. One particular one that I think is pretty interesting is, let's see here. Which one is this? Let me just make sure I get the scripture right. It talks about how Israel will be a cup of trembling for the nations around it, and the whole world will be gathered up trying to figure out what to do with this country. And it sounds exactly like Israel is right now. And before 1948, this would sound like a ridiculous prophecy. Israel didn't even have a country, and now literally the whole world is discussing this country that's as big as San Diego County, night and day.
Yeah, but at the time that verse was written, you haven't found the verse, have you? At the time it was written, Israel was a nation, and those words were describing that particular nation at that particular time. Does the prophecy say anything about 1948?
No, it doesn't say anything about 1948.
Why not? Didn't God know the date? Why can't prophecies be specific? Why couldn't? It would really impress me if that prophecy said, Israel will be dispersed into the nations, and for 2,000 years, and on the year 1948, they will come back and establish a new nation, and then at that time, the Egyptians were this, and you know what I'm saying? If it was clear and specific, absolutely. Instead of having to dig back through and to try to find some verse that you think is a prophecy of today and try to make it fit, it's very fuzzy, it's very fudgy. I'm not convinced by this kind of fuzziness. I would be convinced, and I would happily change my mind if you'd come up with something clear and strong. You know what I'm saying? Anybody could. I could say that about America. America is going to have trouble with its enemies someday. Is that a prophecy?
Well, I understand where you're going and your problem with this, and I think in large it's the same kind of problem that I heard from the atheists when I was on Reggie's show, and it's just that you don't like God's plan. You don't like the way it's laid out. You don't like the way prophecies are laid out.
Why are you saying that? Now you're engaging in ad hominem. You're trying to second guess my psychology. What if I did in fact like God's plan, but still was intellectually honest enough to say that I think the Bible is contradictory? That's really unfair to accuse somebody of having ulterior motives when I have told you and everybody that I want to follow the truth wherever it leads. Even if I don't like God's plan, I would still follow it if it was the truth. I'm not stupid.
Well, he's given you prophecies, and you don't like how they're worded.
Well, I don't see them as prophecies. It's you who's telling me it's a prophecy, but I don't see the Bible itself telling me this is a prophecy. It's you later Christians coming along, reinterpreting what you think was a prophecy. I'd like to see an actual... In fact, there's plenty of evidence of failed prophecies in the Bible. You know,
if you take these in context, these prophecies are talking about future events. And
yeah,
so
but
obviously
when?
not about something that's happening at the time.
Isn't it true, though, that prophecy that you just mentioned was actually fulfilled during that nation's time? I mean, the Israelites were already having trouble with their neighbors. They were already being beset at that time.
Well, Zechariah 12, 1, 2, and 3 was the one I was talking about. And I think verse 3 is the telling verse because it says, Jerusalem shall be a very heavy stone for all peoples. And we can see that right now.
But wait a minute. What page is that on? Wait a minute. I mean, it's one thing to blithely throw out these prophecies around. Zechariah what?
Zechariah 12, 1, verses 1 through 3.
All right. Now, who's speaking here? Zechariah?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, the word of the Lord concerning Israel. Thus says the Lord, who stretched out the heavens and founded the earth. Now, that's what he thinks, right? Formed the human spirit. I am about to make Jerusalem a cup of... In other words, right now, today, I am about to make Jerusalem a cup of reeling for all the surrounding peoples. It will be against Judah. Is there a nation of Judah right now? Also in the siege against Jerusalem. Today, is there a nation of Judah? No, there isn't. On that day, I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the peoples who will lift it, shall grievously hurt themselves, and all the nations of the earth shall come together against it. Okay. Where in the world does this talk about 1948? Where does it talk about any of the nations today that are attacking Israel? This was these people back then bewailing their own predicament.
Okay.
And he mentions Judah. So there's an evidence that is not a prophecy about today, and yet you think it is for some reason.
Well, it doesn't have to say 1948. The reason why I said that is because it wouldn't make any sense, I said, before Israel became a nation, because it's obviously a nation in this. And just because it says the word Judah, Judah is still a place. It could still be considered a place in Israel. Or
it's people. It will be against, of all the surrounding peoples, it will be against Judah also in the siege against Jerusalem. So he's talking about something that's supposed to be happening right then. This is not a prophecy about the future. Do you see what happens in the Christian mindset when you find something that you think might apply to your special case, and you make it apply, and you say, look, there are 600 prophecies about the Messiah or whatever. But when you scratch beneath the surface and look at each of these, you don't find it. I used to preach verses. I used to preach just like you're preaching right now, and I used to feel so confident about it. But scratch beneath the surface, and you start seeing the theological bias. It happens in all religions. It's happening to you right now.
Yeah, how about Ezekiel 38 and 39? Do you think those have come to pass, or do you think that's... Because what you're going... It's typical atheistic rhetoric, what you're giving me, and that is this stuff does not apply to me, and this stuff is untrue.
Rhetoric is probably not the right word. I'm trying to examine it and see what it actually says. What's the verse in Ezekiel?
Ezekiel 38 and 39, those two chapters, has been termed the Magog invasion, because it's referring to an invasion that has not happened, where Russia and Turkey and a few of the other surrounding Muslim nations will gang up against Israel.
So you think today's current events are fulfillments of that prophecy?
I don't think that this has happened yet, but I think that the nations are starting to line up in a way that this will happen.
Oh, so then you don't have any evidence that this prophecy, if it is a prophecy, has actually been fulfilled yet, do you?
No, like I just said, it hasn't been fulfilled yet.
So you're prophesying that this prophecy will be fulfilled?
Well, I'm asking you, it was a question to you, has this been fulfilled yet? Because the other one you said was a specific prophecy for that time. It did not apply to us. It has been fulfilled. So I wanted to know what your swing on this one was.
Well, let me find the prophecy first. Where's the actual verse of prophecy in here?
The verse... It just describes, I'm looking at it right now, it describes the battle here.
I am against you, thus says the Lord God, I will turn you around and put hooks in your jaws.
It's referring how Magog or Russia will be drawn into this battle.
They will put hooks in their jaws. They will lead you out with the army, the horses. They're going to have horses?
Well,
is Russia going to attack with horses and horsemen, clothed in full armor, with shields and bucklers and swords? Is that going to come to pass?
You know, you'd had Old Testament writers hundreds of years ago writing things.
Well, don't you see my
same thing
point?
with Revelation. You know, if you have human beings who have never seen or heard a helicopter or a tank or any of these things trying to describe these things. I mean, read further. Maybe when you're off the phone, you could read 38 and 39, because it clearly talks about a nuclear battle and nuclear fallout that happens where they cannot be around the area for 7 months, just as long as it would take for the nuclear material to have their half-life so it doesn't damage people anymore.
I thought the word was nuclear, not nuclear.
Nuclear.
Nuclear. Right?
Isn't that what I said?
I think you said nuclear, but that's all right.
Nuclear.
Well, okay. Let's. This doesn't look like a prophecy about today, but maybe if your prophecy comes true that this prophecy will someday be fulfilled, then I'll have to change my mind. But let me raise a more serious problem here. You're saying that there is a God who knows the future, and that this God is a personal being with free will who can make decisions, right?
I'm sorry. We're getting away from the question, but let's go ahead.
Well, you're talking about prophecy, right?
I was talking about a specific prophecy, but let's talk about what you're saying. Go ahead.
Well, if this God exists,
Uh-huh.
and if he knows the future, like you pretend he knows here,
right,
that means that the set of future facts is fixed. It cannot be changed. If God knows it in advance, then the future is fixed and unchangeable. Otherwise, God wouldn't be omniscient. He wouldn't be able to predict the future. Mm-hmm. If the future is fixed, then that sets some limits on God's power. And also, how can a personal being with free will have any ability to make any decisions if the future is already fixed? God himself cannot even make any decisions because he can't do what he knows that he's not going to do. Therefore, if this kind of God exists, philosophically, this God is not a personal free being. He's more like a robot or something.
I think you jump from God knowing the future to the point where you asserted that God controls the actions, all the actions of human beings.
No, I'm talking about God's own actions, not human beings.
Okay.
I'm talking about God. If God knows what he's going to do tomorrow at 12 noon, right?
Uh-huh.
Then God can't change in the meantime what he's going to do between now and then. He knows it.
Well, I think
right?
there's an instance in Jonah where God had told Jonah to tell Nineveh that Nineveh is going to be wiped out because of their sin, and Nineveh decided to repent with weeping and fasting, and God decided to exercise his perfect mercy on them.
Yeah, but that was clearly conditional. That was a supposed conditional prophecy. I'm talking about these prophecies that are supposedly clear prophecies of something that will happen. Right?
I don't know if that was conditional. In Jonah, it's only 4 chapters, but as far as I could tell, it was God telling them judgment will come on you. And some people have said that looks like God changed his mind or changed. And how could this happen with a changeless God? But in reality, he just decided to use his perfect mercy instead of his judgment.
So before he exercised his mercy, did he have one idea of what the future would be like, but after he exercised his mercy, he changed his mind and had a different idea of what the future would be like? In other words, was he not omniscient to begin with? Was the set of future facts changeable or fixed? You know what I'm saying? If it's changeable, then God doesn't know the future.
Why is that?
Because he doesn't know how the ball's going to bounce. He doesn't know. He's like you and me, right? Mm-hmm. So if God doesn't know the future, then he can't prophesy anything because anything could happen between now and then. You see the philosophical problem here? He's either a free being who can make decisions openly, or else he knows a fixed future that cannot be changed. You can't have it both ways. He might be omniscient, in which case he's not omnipotent. Or he might be prescient, in which case he's not a free being, and he's not worthy of my worship if he's like a robot or a computer program or something.
Okay, I see what you're saying, I think. And I think that the rub is just because God doesn't step in and do the things that you think he should do if he were to exist, that doesn't necessarily mean that he's not there or not powerful or couldn't do something.
I'm not saying that at all. That wasn't my point. My point was that if your definition is right, then something's got to give. You have a mutually incompatible definition of a God, one who knows the future and yet is also a free personal being. I'm not telling him what to do. If there's a God, he can do what he wants to. But I'm just saying that you have a problem with an incompatibility in your definition of what God is like. According to you, Ezekiel 38 predicts a future which will happen, right? And there's no way you or I or even God can change that, right? Is predicting something. And if God can't change that, then God has limits on his power and on his freedom.
Okay.
Therefore, he is something less than the being that you claim to worship.
Okay, well, yeah, the argument that you're using is much more tied into what I said than you realize, because it's the same kind of argument that atheists have used before to say if God can't lie, if God can't steal, if God can't do evil, if he can't do these things, then we're not worshiping an omnipotent God. But it's just, I think this argument stems from a lack of understanding that...
I'm not saying that either, but I've heard atheists say that, and I disagree with it. Because if there's a God, he has a nature, right? And he would want to act in accordance with his nature. So I'm not saying that.
Right.
I know enough about theology and the Bible to know that this God that Christians worship has a particular nature that he usually acts in accordance with, not always. But
that doesn't mean that he's not omnipotent. It just means that he's not doing the things that you or someone else would see as a complete, powerful, all-powerful God.
Well, then it's not just omnipotence, but it's freedom. If in order for you to make a decision, let's say you're going to make a choice about who knows what. You're going to have coffee or tea, or you're going to choose a mate or whatever. In order to have freedom or the illusion of freedom, you have to have at least more than one option available to you, each of which could be freely chosen or rejected. And there has to be a period of time during which there's an uncertainty, during which you could change your mind, right?
Yeah, all humanly speaking, you're correct, I think.
Yeah, and so that's the definition of free will and freedom. If there is a God who is a person, and person requires this freedom to make decisions, then this also applies to God. He also has to have the freedom during a period of uncertainty to be able to change his mind and exercise mercy or justice or to change, you know what I mean? Otherwise, he's not a free being, right? He has to have that period of potential. But
I think God has just bound himself to the promises that he has made us. And if you want to say that that makes him less omnipotent than some other God, then maybe you could say that.
I'm not saying omnipotent. I'm saying less of a person, less of a free person as a personality. He's more like a robot than, you know, he might be totally omnipotent, but he's not the kind of person that I would find admirable to worship as a person. He's more like this force of a huge computer program or something. You know what I'm saying? He's not a being. He's not a personal being if he knows the future. He can't be, because he has no freedom, no choice, no period of potential to change his mind and to be merciful or warm or friendly. You know what I mean? He's not like you and me. He's some kind of a weird creature up there who's running things in a colder kind of impersonal way, and that's the kind of creature that I could not worship or respect.
But on a human level, it's possible to know the future, and then, I mean, to an extent, and still be loving, or isn't it?
Well, none of us know the future. I mean, we get lucky a lot.
I just mean like I'm going to go to work today, or I'm going to do this, or I'm going to do that, or my kid's going to do this tonight, or.
Yeah, but on the way to work, you still have the option. You probably wouldn't exercise it, but you could still change your mind and go somewhere else, right? That's what makes you free. But if you did not have that option, you wouldn't be free. Your hands would drive to work no matter what. You wouldn't have free will. You wouldn't be
I suppose it's giving me even more of a respect for God, realizing now that he has laid down his omnipotence in order to give humans comfort by promising them things.
So he's not omnipotent, you just said.
Well, he's surely omnipotent, but his type of omnipotence is different than the type of omnipotence that you want him to be, apparently.
I don't want him to be anything. I'm just trying to make sense of this Bible. I don't want God to be anything at all. If he exists, he can be whatever he wants to be. I mean, that's not up to me to decide. I'm trying to decide whether or not I think he, first of all, exists at all, and secondly, even if he did, if he was worthy of my admiration. Because I have the free will to choose, don't I?
Right.
I don't have to like him, do I? I don't have to respect him. You know, I could denounce him if I choose. That's part of my freedom, right? And so it's my choice whether or not I find this kind of a being worthy of my respect. And I find him unworthy of my respect. I mean, what's wrong with me exercising my judgment based on moral, intellectual principles to say such a thing?
Okay. Well, let's, do you want to talk about creation for a minute? Origins?
Oh, yeah, what about it?
I'm curious just how do you think that we all got, how do you think we got here?
Well, you can answer that question 100 ways. My mother and dad fell in love and produced a baby.
Yeah, you know what I mean. I mean, like, I mean, like biogenesis. You know, the study of origins. How do you think life came into being?
Well, life is life. I mean, life is. I guess the most common definition of life is a organism that is self-contained and self-replicating, and cares about its own survival. Mm-hmm. So we wouldn't call a crystal alive, even though it is organized and complex. I mean, we wouldn't call a crystal living. It vibrates too. But science shows us very clearly that biological life on this planet came about through the natural process of evolution, and it's continuing now. Mm-hmm. And in fact, many, if not most, Bible-believing Christians accept the fact of evolution. They don't see any conflict between evolution and their faith because they see evolution as one of the tools that their God used to create the world. Who's to say that God could not use evolution? In other words, you're going to tie his hands and say you can't produce life by having it evolve. So,
yeah, there's a couple. Let me respond to that. In order to prove something scientifically, it has to be observed. So when we get into origins...
That's not true, Jason.
Oh, it is true.
No, it's not. You can observe indirectly as well, and you can prove things. I mean, all history would be worthless then, because nobody.
Well, there's different kinds of, there's forensic science, for instance, and I think that's what we use when we're trying to determine the age and the origin of the universe. It's like when you go to a crime scene and you see different things, you try and put together evidence and an argument for what happened. I mean, there's no human being alive today that existed. That witnessed either creation or evolution. So we're all trying to figure out how it happened, what happens.
But that's not exactly true. We are witnessing evolution all the time, on the micro scale and on the macro scale. We are seeing it happen before our eyes.
It hasn't been anything above the species level.
Well, who made that line? Who drew that arbitrary line through the world?
I'm sure that God drew the line on where species can evolve.
You're sure of that, huh? And what about hybrids then between species? I mean.
Yeah, with human intervention, too, things can be done, but you obviously can't use human intervention when you're talking about origins because no humans were around.
Well, exactly, but we still know from science. I mean, evolution is a fact of science. There is no doubt about it.
Absolutely. Microevolution is a fact of science.
So is macroevolution between among species. That is a fact.
Right.
There are all sorts of species that are extinct. There are all sorts of variations within species that we see happening in the wild, documented day-to-day. Variation.
I agree. The primrose plant is one example, and it's been proven to produce a different species on its own.
So what's the problem then? I mean, there's no.
Well, the problem is because we have never seen anything go from, say, ape to man, and we don't have this fossil bed of intermediate fossils that prove that this happened.
On the contrary, we certainly do. We have all sorts of fossil evidence of species descending from ancestors. No one claims that anything went from an ape to a man. What evolution claims is that humans and the other apes all come from a common ancestor. Just like you and your brothers or sisters came from a common ancestor. You didn't come from each other, right? And yet you're different from each other, and yet you came from an ancestor who's slightly different from you. I mean, that's just one of the facts of biological life. We all evolved from common ancestors, and you go back far enough, we come from one common ancestor.
Yeah, it's interesting how people have even admitted that, even evolutionists. It's called the I forget what the Eve theory or something. How some evolutionists do believe that we all came from one person, two people.
Well, no, they don't. You're talking about the mitochondrial Eve?
Right.
Well, no one claims. I mean, what they claim is that there was one ancestral woman who ended up becoming the mother of all the descendants who exist today. But there were other humans in it. There were other mothers. She wasn't the only one.
Right.
It's like if you have a family with 4 sons in it, or 4 daughters, and only one of them has a child and the other one doesn't, and the other one have children that don't survive into the future. That's what the mitochondrial or the other types of, there's different kinds of Eves. It depends how far back you want to go, but it wasn't a single woman and a single man who suddenly popped out of nowhere. They were descendants from ancestors. And besides that, what's the problem? I mean, why is this a problem when millions of good Bible-believing Christians accept the fact of evolution at all levels?
Okay, well, the problem is that, well, let me just, I got to quote Darwin first, and then I'll tell you what the problem is. I love the quote that when he said in the 1800s that there must be an enormous fossil bed found with intermediate fossils, or my theories really don't hold much water. And that has not been found. People have looked for years and years and years, and they haven't found this huge fossil existence to prove that there was all this changing. And that's where people started saying, okay, then there was really fast jumps. People just jumped from one to the next, in this big leap, evolutionary leap, and it's kind of ridiculous,
Okay, but I'm still asking you, what's the problem? I mean, true or false? What are we dealing with here?
Okay.
I mean, suppose evolution is false. I mean, what is your basic overriding point here? Suppose I say, oh, golly gee, we were all wrong about evolution. Well, then what?
Then the problem is, well, if you're wrong about evolution, then there's no problem. But if the preaching of evolution and it being in public schools and not giving creation equal time, and
what do you mean not giving? I mean, there are many Christians who believe that evolution is part of creation.
That's not the issue.
Well, then
I'm
what
talking
is
about
it?
public schools and the teaching of each theory.
You mean Genesis is what you're talking about?
Yeah, intelligent design.
You're viewing this as a contest between scientific evolution and the book of Genesis.
Intelligent design and the creation account in Genesis, I think, are very compelling.
Well, no one's telling parents they can't teach that to their kids if that's their particular mythology that they want to follow. The book of Genesis is a story. It's not science.
And when I read millions and millions of years in my textbook, that is a story also.
Well, yeah, but it's a story that has radiocarbon testing and has strata and it has a comparative anatomy. It has comparative genetics. It makes predictions about what we will find.
Right,
it has a fossil record. It has.
I'm not saying to get rid of science. I think science and the Bible go hand in hand. I think I'm not saying that at all. But when you talk about dating methods, when you don't count into things like a universal flood with cataclysmic activity and volcanoes,
because the Bible said it happened, right? You're really talking about the Bible. You're putting the Bible against modern science, and you think the Bible should have an equal voice in the classroom, in the science classroom, right? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm saying that evolution. Well, I was saying about the flood that it really throws off dating methods. And, I mean, you probably know as well as I do that people use radiocarbon dating and they can get 10 different dates for the same fossil. And it's really not a reliable source of dating.
Okay, but don't you see what I'm asking you? I'm asking you, so what? Let's throw all that out and then say, what are you saying? Are you saying that the book of Genesis is scientific? Is that what you are saying and should be taught in the science classroom?
I'm saying the book of Genesis is a legitimate account of our origins and the best and the closest thing that we have to the truth.
Okay, if that's true, then what scientific experiments or tests or methodologies are being conducted to demonstrate the hypothesis that the book of Genesis is scientific? Where is the science in creation science? What journals are accepting articles of publication proving through empirical methods that Eve came out of Adam's body and so on? Where is the science in Christian science? Tell me that.
Well, science, in order to prove something scientifically, it must be observed. So as soon as you use the word millions and millions of years, it puts you on the same level as Genesis, because we're talking forensic type science that cannot be observed. We're talking religion is what we're talking.
We do observe millions of years of rock strata going back and back and back. The further back you go, the simpler the fossils become. The further back these rocks go, and even if the dating is wrong, there is still a progression of time.
Well, that progression was seen at the eruption at Mount St. Helens. It laid strata just like the Grand Canyon. And, you got to believe if somebody walked up there, had never seen the place, didn't know what was going on, looked at that strata, they would say that took millions of years to happen.
I was just at the Grand Canyon.
It happened in minutes.
Mount St. Helens just put up ash, basically. Did it put up these different...
Oh, it laid down strata. It caused a significant mud flow and ran into the lake, and you can see the strata if you go there or if you see a video.
Well, of course you can find strata, but, they don't find the same levels. And do they find, like, higher up in the strata, do they find complex fossils, but the deeper they go, do they find simpler and simpler fossils until they get back to the trilobites and even before that? Is that what they find? This is really good evidence that tests the hypothesis of evolution. Where is the evidence that tests the hypothesis of Genesis? That's what I'm asking.
Well, it's just one of those kind of bait and switch things. Yes, we can prove microevolution, so macroevolution above the species level must have happened. And no one has observed that to happen yet.
Yes, they have. Because you know why? Because scientists don't even agree how to define what a species is.
Okay.
There are no hard lines between species. Some scientists say these two things are different species, but other scientists say, wait a minute, no, they're not. They can interbreed. You don't know where to draw the lines between species either. And when a population has been isolated long enough so that they can't or won't breed with each other, we call that a species. I think the Bible calls them kinds, but we do see changes all the time. Even today, we see the changes between different what we would call a species, like the finches on the Galapagos. We see basic anatomical beak-size changes over after a period of drought, or let's say, or heavy rain. These things do happen, but still, we're getting off the point. If Genesis is true in any kind of scientific way, then where is the scientific confirmation for the Book of Genesis?
Scientific confirmation. I think I answered this question already.
Mount St. Helens.
No. My answer was that it's on level ground with the quote-unquote science that is taught when you say the words millions and millions of years. It's just stuff that can't be proven. It's theory. It's religion, really.
So what you're saying is that actual evolutionary science is not good science and has no confirmation. Therefore, the Book of Genesis, which is also not good science and doesn't have this confirmation, should be allowed to stand at the equal low level. Where is your proof of Genesis, was what I'm asking. Why should it even be considered as a scientific truth? You hear what I'm saying?
Yeah, and that's one way to put it. And even putting it the way you did, which was a little callous, it still goes to show that both theories are on level ground. And that's all I'm saying, is that both theories should be taught.
So you're saying evolution is bad and Genesis is just as bad. That's what you're basically saying.
I'm saying that the evolution of species, I don't like to say evolution because evolution happens with a micro level and even in the species level sometimes, but the evolution of species from microbe to man has not been proven and cannot be proven. And
I disagree with you. The evolution of species from microbe to man, to humans, has been proven by just about any possible way. Comparative genetics is one way to show it. There are microbes that contain the exact same sequence of genetic material in their genes that we have within ours. We can show common ancestry as you branch out. It's like proving that two people are cousins. How would you do that? You would do that by showing the similarities in their looks and then looking at how, who their parents were, and then they're not the same people. And the same thing happens if you would study evolution. Look at some of the good books. I mean, what was the last pro-evolution book that you read? It's wonderful science. It's exciting science because it's teaching us something, not more than just, I believe God created the earth. It's teaching us something real about the world we live in. And it's much better than those sermons I used to preach about sin and salvation.
It's just all based on false assumptions. It's
Says
philosophy,
who?
It's theory.
Says who?
Based on dating methods that can't be proven.
Says who?
It's based on things that people weren't around to observe. It's just not science.
Jason, where is the scientific journal that demonstrates that these dating methods are unreliable? Point me to something that the scientific community now says, yep, we have to throw out these dating methods. What are you quoting when you make that statement?
Well, I can give you some websites and you can check it out.
Websites? You don't have it, though. You don't know it right now.
Oh, yeah, you can go to drdino.com, Answers in Genesis.
But, I mean, I'm asking the scientific. I'm not asking the pro-religious ones. Where is the scientific community admitting that these dating methods are faulty? Where are they saying that?
Well, I mean, I could find you that by the end of the hour. Scientific people know, anybody who's honest will know, and paleontologists generally admit this, that they get multiple dates when they try and date things. And they just pick, and they choose, they guess which one. They say, well, it was found here about this time. And
what paleontologist is saying that?
I'll have to get you these people's names.
It sounds to me suspiciously like you're passing on creation science dogma rather than real science here. Of course there are differences, and one of the strengths of science is that it allows for the differences of opinion. Yes, the dates can vary by maybe as much as centuries, but relative dates, you can still use dating methods, even if they vary by a few centuries. When you talk about millions of years, you get really close degree of accuracy. And, of course, the relative dates are all going to be the same. We know this happened first and this happened next. And it depends what you're dating. Are you debating the wood in the campfire, or are you debating the rocks next to the campfire? There's all sorts of variables. Scientists aren't stupid. They're not being led by some blind evolutionary mindset.
But they are biased, though. And they are controlled in their brain from first grade onward to believe that we evolved in millions and millions of years. And they surely don't get any promotions when they step up and say, yeah, I believe that God created everything.
Okay, so
they surely don't get any accolades for that.
Okay, so you're saying it's wrong for a person to be brainwashed that we evolved for millions of years from childhood, but it's not wrong for a child in Sunday school to be brainwashed that we were created by the book of Genesis. What makes believers exempt from error in the same way that you think scientists are full of error? What makes you so special in your understanding and in your own biases? Because you just happen to want to pick the right religion and you don't like the implications of evolution? Why? Are you talking scientifically here, or are you more of an ideologue who wants to make a rhetorical point? You have no scientific evidence for creation. What creationists do is they spend all their time bashing evolution.
That's not true. Maybe in the 1800s or something they did.
Even today, read Henry Morris, read Duane Gish.
I've read tons of them. I have the books on my shelf right there.
Well, read them. The fossils say no. What they're pretending is that if you could somehow demolish evolution, that would make creationism win by default without having to actually provide a case for creationism. They come to creationism a priori. They come to it as true regardless, and the way they think they can win the fight is by destroying evolution. Suppose they did. Suppose they destroyed evolution completely. They can't, but suppose they did. Now, where's their case? Where's their science for their book of Genesis? They have nothing. And you have to admit, there is nothing. There's no experiments. There's no observational records. There are no data that's being kept. All you have is a belief of something that was taught to you in Sunday school.
Well, one instance of some proof for the biblical accounts, and all they can do is try and prove or argue that the biblical accounts happened. One is, usually atheists or evolutionists will agree that there were worldwide, small, localized floods all over the world. That's how they'll describe seashells up on the highest mountains and such. And a worldwide flood, describes that perfectly too. As an elementary example. But it's just as much science as it is as saying there are a bunch of small floods over millions of years.
Well, yeah, of course there were localized floods. My own American Indians had their own flood myths in there.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting that the Chinese had a flood story that they took away. The Chinese have been known as an exclusive culture all by themselves up there for a long time. And their very characters, I read a book called The Discovery of Genesis, and it showed how the events of the Garden of Eden and the flood were actually in their Chinese characters.
Well, that's not surprising. You find all sorts of similarities among human cultures because of the way, our human nature values certain things, and we've all had similar experiences. So it's not surprising that you'll find different religions that have different echoes of similar themes. But
the word tempter, for instance, showed a person in a garden, behind the two trees. It's just like the imagery that was used to communicate these words. The word boat, about Noah and the little boat object and the people in it. It's too obvious that it relates directly back from the flood.
It's too obvious. Just like those prophecies that you put in here are too obvious. When you scratch beneath the surface. I'm not ruling out what you're saying, but let's look at it. I used to preach the gospel with such conviction, and then I would go scratch beneath the surface, and it was painful to realize, oops, I'm exaggerating here. Oops, I'm telling everybody else that they're deceived, but what about myself?
I strive pretty hard to stick as closely as I can to the Bible. I have heard lots of people exaggerate or even add to the Bible or apply it incorrectly, but I think it's wise to stay as closely as I can and take a little small steps out from it.
Well, that's what everybody says. In the book of Genesis, you're talking about the trees in the Garden of Eden.
Mm.
In Genesis chapter 1, the trees were created before humans. But in Genesis chapter 2, the trees were created after humans. There's two different creation stories in the book of Genesis. And those very trees that Eve was supposedly standing behind, or the serpent, and besides, it wasn't a serpent. Genesis does not say it was a serpent. If you're going to stick with the book of Genesis, it does say it's a serpent. It doesn't say it's the devil. It says it's the Nachash, if you know the Hebrew word. And so the book of Genesis has these two contradictory creation stories that cannot be reconciled, and yet we're supposed to pretend that this is allowed to stand as a scientific account of the origin of human
It's funny that you mentioned that. I just got that question in my forum yesterday, and I'm going to get to that. I have the answer to it, but I just need to do a little more research to go ahead and put it right.
And you think in advance that there must be an answer to this, right? Don't you see how you're committed in advance? With your kind of thinking, I'm trying not to be ad hominem here, but I used to be like you. With the way I used to think, I was actually blind to the possibility that the Bible had contradictions, because I would not allow myself to see what was before my very eyes. The Bible is discrepant and contradictory, and yet if you go into it with a mindset that there must be an answer, and I'll get back to you and find it for you, well, then of course you're going to find something. I mean, we could all
Absolutely, but it doesn't necessarily mean the answers that I find are contrived or they're wrong. I mean, I believe, since the prophecies that I've seen in the Bible, since the experiences in my life, and God's power and the human body and creation and just so many phenomenal things.
But you keep saying that prophecies, but you haven't given me a good example of a prophecy yet. You keep saying this, but you don't fess up. I mean, you don't actually give us the meat that we're asking for.
Okay, well, probably the most incredible prophecy of the Bible, and I was trying to get to this one eventually, and might as well tackle it now, is the one in Daniel when he predicts the exact day that Jesus will walk into Jerusalem. Are you familiar with that one?
Yeah, I know all about that. Tell me the verse again.
I believe it's Daniel 9, 24 through 26.
And does he mention Jesus?
He mentions Messiah the King.
Okay, now where does he say the exact day? Is it a Tuesday, or is it a March 3rd or something? Where does he say the day?
Well, he gives a mathematical prophecy, and I can read it for you. Do you want to read it?
I have it right here. 24 through what?
If you want to get the whole thing, you probably need to start with 20 through 26. But if you really just want to get the skinny for the date, you can read it here. It says, "Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince or Messiah the King, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Their streets shall be built again, and the wall even in troublesome times. And after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself, and the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end of it shall be with a flood, or a diaspora, and just till the end of the war, desolations are determined."
Well, that looks kind of bad. I mean, 62 weeks, we're only talking about a few years.
Well, that's an idiom, the Jewish idiom, like we have for a week. It's an idiom for a week of years.
Oh, really? Where does it say that? How do you prove that?
I just talked to some Jewish people. It's a tradition.
But how do they demonstrate that it's a week of years? Where is that demonstrated? This says weeks here.
Demonstrated when you realize that it predicts to the exact day that Jesus came into Jerusalem, then you work backwards from there, I suppose.
70 weeks are decreed. So 70 years? It says weeks, but it means years. So the Bible doesn't mean what it says, and somehow somebody thinks that these weeks are translated into years. Besides, your people to finish the transgression, put an end to sin, that hasn't happened. To bring everlasting righteousness, the most holy place, therefore,
You're right.
time.
You're right. The key here is to notice that after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, not for himself, and that's referring to when Jesus died, of course. And then there's a week of time in there that's an interval that hasn't happened yet. So what have you known about this prophecy? Have you studied it?
Well, I read it briefly, but I have no evidence at all that these weeks refer to years. None at all. I mean, it seems like an after-the-fact interpretation. Just the fact that some modern Jews might say that, I would like to know, why didn't they say here, why didn't they use the word years, which they use in other cases, and then why didn't they use the name Jesus? Why didn't they say that this will be the Messiah named Jesus to rebuild Jerusalem and all that? Why is it such a vague thing,
the Messiah the King, I don't think anybody else would ever have that title. And it was a pretty common idiom, like the word century. We just know the word century means, 100. It's not that uncommon to people reading this text at the time. It talks about from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince. So obviously we have to know when this command happened, and we can see this command in Nehemiah 2, 1 through 18. King Artaxerxes, it says, "And it came to pass in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes," et cetera, et cetera. It goes on to say...
he says he uses the word year there, not weeks.
That's right, that's right.
So what about all these weeks? Why don't they say years here in Daniel? Why is he using the word weeks in Daniel? To me, this sounds very suspect. It sounds like somebody has gone back through the Bible and said, oh, let's make these weeks into years, and then we can make it come out kind of close to what we want our Messiah to be born. With no actual talk about Bethlehem or being born of a virgin or any of those things.
Well, those things are mentioned in different passages of the Bible. All these things are mentioned.
Well, those were false prophecies. You have to know that. Isaiah 7:14 was a false prophecy about the virgin, and it was a mistranslation of the Greek Septuagint. So you studied the Bible enough to know that Matthew was working from a mistranslation, and that Isaiah wasn't even talking about the virgin, a virgin woman at all. He's talking about a young woman.
Yeah, so, I've read those arguments, and
well, they're good arguments. They're correct arguments. It's only Matthew who got it wrong. Whoever wrote the book of Matthew was pretty sloppy in his scholarship. He thought he had hit on something. He wasn't even using the original sources. He was using a Greek translation, and he trusted a Greek translation which turned out to have mistakes in it. You're not saying that the Septuagint was divinely inspired translation of the Word of God. Otherwise, it wouldn't have those mistakes in it. And yet Matthew was working from a flawed book.
Okay, well, I want to send you this website and have you check it out because I've just documented, we kind of skipped around and we only did about a quarter of my research on this prophecy. But I want you to see how it indicates the exact day, March 14th, 445 BC, that the decree was given, and then the exact day where Jesus came into Jerusalem and proclaimed himself as Messiah and let people worship him. There's only one day when he really let people worship him and proclaimed to be Messiah. That was Palm Sunday, right before he died.
Where does it say that in Daniel 9, that Jesus will enter Jerusalem and be the Messiah? I don't see that anywhere. An anointed prince, 7 weeks, trouble 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off, have nothing, and the troops of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city. So, in other words, Jesus' disciples destroy Jerusalem. The troops of the prince shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. It will come with flood. So is this prophesying that Jesus' disciples destroy Jerusalem? If this is Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
So that looks like a failed prophecy to me right there. Desolation. There hasn't been any desolation after. It wasn't just any of that. He'll make a strong covenant for 1 week and for half of the week. So in other words, he's living on. This Messiah is living on past that point. Because when Jesus entered Jerusalem, wasn't it Palm Sunday, the week before he died?
Right.
But now this is talking about the half of the week and another 1 week after that. Are these years now or weeks now? What are they?
The prince shall come destroy the city and the sanctuary. I was looking at the last thing that you said about the people of the prince destroying the city. It just sounds like you're trying to analyze this with a bias already.
Bias? I'm trying to look at the words and see what they say. I'm trying to analyze it with a non-bias. I'm trying to actually look at it. You said weeks meant years, right?
Right.
But after this Messiah supposedly comes in on Palm Sunday, he will make a strong covenant for 1 week, right? So is that 1 week or is that a week of years? Which one is that?
Okay, actually, what that's talking about, which verse are you in?
27.
Okay.
He shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half the week he shall make sacrifice and offering cease.
See, I didn't even mention verse 27. When you're getting onto that, you're getting onto a totally different time period.
But it's saying he. Look, an anointed one shall come, and the troops of the prince, it shall come with the flood. He shall make a strong covenant. Read it in context, Jason, and see what this whole thing is talking about.
Okay, well, let me read it real slowly. 26, and after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, which is an idiom for death, but not for himself. He died for everybody else. And the people of the prince who is to come, he's not the prince to come. He's the prince.
Wait a minute. How do you know that? That's the prince. The verse before that is talking about rebuild Jerusalem.
No, he already came and he died. He's not going to be the prince to come. The people of the prince to come, who is the Antichrist.
He is the prince who is to come from the time that this prophecy was supposedly written, right?
No. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. And we know that the Romans destroyed it, right? The end of it shall be with a flood, the diaspora. That's when the Jews are scattered all over the world. Until the end of the war, desolations are determined. Now on to 27, then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. And we have an interval in there. And this is what we're in right now, the church interval. And this correlates exactly with Revelation. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, which is 7 years. I'm sure you probably have read this in Revelation. The Antichrist has a covenant for 7 years, but in the middle of the week, in the middle, 3.5 year period.
Yeah, but I don't make you jump between one prince and another here. I don't see that in the text. It looks to me like creative rewriting or reinterpreting of what you think, in all these weeks and all that. It doesn't look convincing to me. I mean, right. I was a preacher, an ordained minister, and I've translated a lot of this. And it looks to me like whoever wrote the New Testament is saying, well, let's try to make some of these things happen here. And besides, the stuff at the end, you have no idea if it's a prophecy is going to happen or not. An anointed prince didn't say the Son of God. It doesn't say he's the deity. It just says an anointed prince, right? I mean, anybody can be anointed.
For Christ.
Anybody can be anointed. I mean, Elijah and Moses were anointed.
The Hebrew is the Mashiach Najid, and that's Messiah the Prince, Messiah the King. It wasn't just a title that was used for other people.
But it doesn't mean deity. It doesn't mean a son of God. Why didn't he say, God will have a son named Jesus born in Bethlehem, his mother will be named Mary? Why couldn't it be a prophecy that's really clear to convince? I know. Why all this fuzziness? Well, exactly. You're offering to me evidence that there's a fulfilled prophecy, but when we look at the prophecy itself, we don't really see what you claim, what you're overlaying your Christian theology on top of this, as if you think this prophecy was somehow fulfilled.
Yeah, I just think you're laying a skeptical bias over this also. And
well, I'm proud of that. Skepticism is the way to truth. Skepticism is the way to learn if something's true or false. It's better to be skeptical and doubtful than to just be blinded into accepting what theology is handed to you. Mm-hmm. I'm proud of the skepticism. I admit it. Criticism is really the best and only way to learn what's true or false, because you can strip off error that way.
I mean, it's just like you're looking at a Ford Festiva and going, it's not a Festiva, it's a Ford Festiva. And you're wrong, it's not a Festiva, it's a Ford Festiva. And I mean, all it is semantics, really. And if you want to risk, your eternal life on a word that you're not too sure might go one way or the other, it just seems like a foolish thing to do.
Yes, I do, Jason. I'm not afraid of risking my eternal life. I don't buy this threat mentality that a lot of Christians have, that you better believe or you're going to be punished. It doesn't
and this
scare
isn't my mentality. I mean, it's not my words. I'm not telling you something I made up,
Well, it doesn't bother me. I mean, it's like Christians use that all the time, you're going to risk your eternal life if you don't think the way I do. Fine. If there's a God who wants to send me to hell for thinking for myself, then let him do it. Let him prove what a macho man he is and send me to hell. Will that make me worship him anymore? Will that make me have any more respect for the integrity of supposed word of his? No, it won't. I'm proud of the skepticism. I'm happy to be a critic. I'm glad that somebody should denounce and put this very God under the microscope. Don't you see what I'm saying?
Though, how a prophecy that says over 400 years in advance predicts something to the exact day, you reject just because the wording isn't adequate for you.
Well, I don't see it as a prophecy. I see the word weeks here. And yes, you're right. I reject it because I don't see it as adequate. Besides, if it were, that would be one thing that most, that would be one of the proofs of a foreknowing God, right? Mm-hmm. And so, and yet the whole world hasn't come to this conclusion. Obviously, this is a Jewish Israelite. Daniel was making a prophecy for his own time, and he didn't say years, and he didn't say Jesus, the Son of God. He didn't say Messiah. So in my book, this is it's not even a prophecy, but if it is, it's a very weak one and not very convincing, especially when you have New Testament writers coming along with the freedom to write what they want, right? Mm-hmm. And like in the book of Revelation, to say, let's tie Daniel and our views together. Of course, the writers of the book of Revelation were familiar with the Old Testament. There were some real scholars back then. So what I would like to see is...
And some of them were. Some of them were fishermen, too. Yeah, they weren't...
Yeah. Well, exactly. They were all trained, though, in some kind of training. But I'd like to see confirmation of these things happening.
What do you think about the concept, just for argument's sake, I know you said there's no sin or sin doesn't exist, but sin, let's take the biblical definition for a moment, and what do you think about universal sin? It seems to me that since there are no pockets, there are no time periods, there's no places on the earth since the beginning of history, recorded history, that have been exempt from sin, from murder, lying, stealing, cheating, sin like that, that would go to prove that there was some kind of unseen power that is tempting and causing these people to do these sins.
Well, that's that is a religious spin on human nature. To posit some kind of a force to explain human nature. All species, not just humans, but all species are engaged in a struggle for survival. All of them are. When you see a cat playing with a mouse before it kills it, that's sin or not? You wouldn't call that sin. You would just call it part of the cat's human nature, right? You wouldn't say the cat was willfully sinning against its cat creator or something. It's doing something by instinct which is harmful, and we might even say unnecessarily harmful to this mouse who also has the desire to live, right? We see callousness and cruelty in nature, and we are a part of nature, and part of our human nature and our survival has been to combat these other natural forces, and that's how we evolved, with instincts to combat. So, of course, human nature is going to have testosterone, exaggerated aggression. Of course it's going to have those things, and of course there will be human beings who act more in their own self-interest than in the interest of the group at large. And religious people might call that a sin, and those of us who are secular naturalists would say, it's too bad we're saddled with this nature that we've got, but we couldn't pick it. We couldn't choose it. And if we do wish to continue to be rational, moral creatures, then we need to find a way to improve the situation. Certainly the Bible and Christianity hasn't helped. If anything, it's made it worse.
So you're saying it's not a person's fault, it's genetics?
Well, yeah, it is genetics, but it's also the person's fault, because if you commit an action within a society, you are the one responsible for those actions, of course. I mean, if you went crazy for some reason and came and started attacking me for who knows what reason, say you were a religious fanatic and you wanted to bomb my house, then
that would never do.
Of course not.
No.
You have the true religion, right? Of course not. But if you were to be that way, then I, by nature, would want to protect myself and my family, and I would exercise at least the minimal amount of force necessary to stop you. And I would hope we could make laws and have systems of self-defense or justice or enforcement to protect myself from my interest from your interest. And I don't call that sin. I would say that it's too bad. There's something, a lot of criminals are actually ill. There's an actual mental illness or that, a sociopath is actually mentally ill. The sociopath doesn't feel the pain of others. And we can point to the actual physical, chemical, natural causes of these things. Still, we should put them in jail or put them in a mental hospital. We need to protect the rest of us. But we shouldn't paint human beings with some kind of a tainted brush that we have some demonic or evil on us in some way. Otherwise, how do we improve? What hope is there unless we can work around that?
Why would conviction evolve? You do something wrong and you feel bad about it. If we're just concerned about our own well-being and living and success and reproducing, why would we want or need or have conviction evolve?
Well, see, now you're asking a good naturalistic question, and that's a healthy question. Social biologists are asking questions like this all the time. But it makes sense that if we, as natural human beings, value our individuality and, by extension, our own species, we put value on it because what is value? Value is something that you want, right? And we want our lives to continue. Therefore, it's obvious to see that with your own family members, your brothers, your sisters, your children, they have so much of the same genetic material that you do. By protecting your own family members, well, my goodness, we have this instinct within us to protect our genetic investment in the future. Our cousins are a little further away, but they're still part of our species. Our next-door neighbors are much further away genetically, but they're still part of our species. So that instinct to protect our genetics and our close genetics can be extended to the rest of the world as well. And feelings are feelings. They certainly didn't come from outside of the human race, whatever they are.
Okay. I need to ask you about that one.
There's natural answers, or at least potential natural answers to these questions without a knee-jerk religious answer, is what I'm saying.
That's very true. I've found that for every spiritual or religious answer there is to something, there's always an earthly or a normal answer also.
What do you mean spiritual? What does that word mean?
Oh, for instance, atheists hate to hear the argument that God did it. They want to hear proof. They want scientific proof. But for every God put the moon in the sky. God makes the
No, but you use the word spirit, spiritual. What does that word mean? spiritual?
What does spiritual mean?
Yeah, the word itself. What are you talking about when you use the word spirit and spiritual?
It's related to God and the Spirit.
But what does spirit mean? What is it?
Spirit would be something, there's a Holy Spirit, that's part of the Trinity.
But what is a Holy Spirit? What is the thing that you're describing?
The Spirit is just part of, that's a good question. It's not easy to describe the Spirit since we don't see the Spirit.
Well,
from the God's Word, I guess we know about the Spirit. Same thing with God.
But what do we know about? What is it that we are knowing about when you use the word Spirit? What is the thing that goes to that label?
Well, when I say spirit, I mean there's all kinds of spirits. There would be evil spirits. There'd be good spirits.
What do you mean, spirits? What is it? You mean it's like a little gremlin with black hair? What are you talking about when you use the word spirit?
Well, there's the spirits, the angels that fell from heaven that are now spirits because we can't see them. That would be one spirit.
But you're not defining you're giving me examples of spirits, but I'm asking for a definition of the word spirit and spiritual. Not examples.
If I had to define the word spirit, I would just say something that cannot be seen, that where there are good or bad, whether it be good or bad, basically something to that effect.
So something that cannot be seen, something, you mean a physical thing? You use the word thing.
Thing or entity, maybe?
Entity, okay, an entity of what? Like a basketball or an ice cream cone? When you use the word spirit, I used to preach that word all the time. But you know what? The word spirit has no definition except in terms of what it's not. It's intangible, non-corporeal. The word spirit has never been defined, and yet you're using an undefined word that even you admit has no comprehensible definition. You're using it to a natural person like me as if it makes any kind of sense. I reject that word. That word has no meaningful reference in the real world to me. And so if you use it in an argument, you have a non-argument, unless you define the word spirit in a coherent way.
Yeah, well, I can tell that you've come across this before, and what we're doing here, same thing with trying to describe God. God is clearly above our thoughts and our minds.
Says who?
So all we can do is describe God. You can't necessarily define God, but you can describe Him. You can compare Him to things that we know. Does that make sense?
No, it doesn't make sense at all. I mean, why do you say He's above? Why don't you say He's below? I mean, where do you get these definitions?
I guess from the Bible.
Yeah, and why is the Bible true? Because God wrote it, right? See, it's a circular argument. What if I say, I don't trust the Bible? What if I say that? Using my own mind, I look at it, I study it, I read the original language. What if I say they can't define this word, and so I'm not going to hold it in much regard. I'll look at it, and there might be something in it. But don't you see the circularity of your thinking? You think there actually is a God because the Bible tells you there is a God. And you know the Bible is God's Word because God wrote the Bible. It's a circular thing. You're wanting to believe something that you just want to believe.
Well, there's more reasons that I believe besides what you just mentioned.
Like prophecies.
Prophecies. There's experiential knowledge.
Experiential knowledge?
Yeah.
What, you mean you know God personally?
Yeah.
Has he talked to you?
Yeah.
He does. Is he like a baritone or a tenor or what? He talks to you personally?
Yeah, I ask God questions and He gives me directions.
Well, what does his voice sound like?
I feel, since you've mocked other points and things, I don't think that this is going anywhere besides.
Of course it is.
Where you're going to mock it.
I'm not mocking it. Don't be self-sensitive. We're trying to get at truth here. Anybody who says that God tells them something, and God tells people all sorts of things, right? And people say they talk to God, or they talk to the Virgin Mary, or they talk to Napoleon or Elvis Presley. How do you know that you are not equally deceived by this idea that there's a God talking to you?
I guess it kind of sounds like the conscience. Like before, I was trying to get to the point where conscience couldn't have just evolved. That conscience was put into our heart and mind by God, and now that's what his voice sounds like. It sounds like my conscience. I ask him, God, should I do this? And then God tells me no, or yes, or maybe,
in English,
or this or that.
Does he use English? Like he uses the word no, N-O, and yes, Y-E-S?
And when I speak to God, He uses English.
Oh, he does. So he speaks, and so you're actually hearing a voice. Is it a high-pitched voice or a low-pitched voice or what?
It's not an audible voice. It's just my conscience. It's in my mind.
So it's like when your mind is thinking a thought.
Sort of.
You're having a dream or something. So how do you know the difference between this supposed voice of God and just some other in creative thoughts in your own mind that you're making up. Don't you agree that a lot of Christians and a lot of religious people just make up what they think God's telling them? How do you know that you're special and you're not just making it up?
Well, to answer your first question, how do I know this is God's voice? I know that it's His voice because it corresponds with His Word. You know, if God tells me, if I think God tells me to go murder someone or something, then I can look in His Word and go, no, this isn't it, because God says don't kill here.
So if God tells you to happy to be dashing babies against the stones, then that is His voice, right?
That was a specific command for the Israelites, remember?
Well, but you said you confirm it with God's Word. If God told
in context.
If God told them to be happy to kill innocent children, and then if God told you to be happy to kill innocent children, you could use the Bible to confirm that that was indeed God's voice, according to your logic.
If I was an Israelite several thousand years ago, then yes. But
So we should throw out those parts of the Bible that were written only to them. The entire Bible was written to people thousands of years ago.
Yeah, and I wouldn't throw out any of it. There's got incredible stories and accounts in the Bible that are
Well, then what parts
true.
of the Bible do you use to confirm whether or not God's talking to you? When Jesus said that, suppose you heard a voice that said, to be a good Christian, you should castrate yourself. Suppose you heard that voice. Men have heard that voice, actually. Origen, an early church father, heard that voice. And he actually took a knife to himself and castrated himself. And then he went to the Bible, in fact, found a verse of Jesus who are saying there are certain men who have become eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it. He was saying that to his own followers, his own disciples, presumably to Origen and to you. Would you take that as a voice of God that you should therefore castrate yourself because Jesus said that he that is able to receive it, let him receive it?
If that's specific thing, I would try and confirm it. I would probably.
Why? Why would you try to confirm? Why not just believe what God tells you?
I probably would then. Yeah.
Because you don't want to castrate yourself, right? You're too smart for that.
Well, if God's Word says it, and if God tells me specifically,
then you would do it?
I suppose it was for me to do.
And then what if God told you to kill me? Would you do it?
No.
The Old Testament, God told people to kill all the time. You know that.
Yeah, I know.
So what if God told you to kill me? You would disobey Him?
Yeah, we had this, the answer to this question, and you're not going to like it, is that God wouldn't tell me to kill you.
How do you know that?
Because I know God.
How do you know that? He told to kill other people all through the Bible.
And there were reasons, and I've given you a reason for every situation you brought up.
What if God told you that I am an evil person and I'm demonically possessed and you need to kill me? And that's the same reasons He gave in the Bible, right? Would you obey God's Word or wouldn't you? You would disobey God then.
The only answer I have is God would not tell me to do that.
So you know the mind of God better than God does.
I know the mind of God maybe better than you do.
Well, I don't think you know the Bible better than I do, but
well, I'm not saying I know better. I'm just playing.
But you see my point, right?
Right.
You like a lot of Christians think somehow you are special and you know God's voice, but all these others, well, they're just not looking at it right, or they're just not mature enough, or they're just not coming at it with the right spirit of humility. But you think somehow you, Jason, what's your last name? You somehow think that you have somehow been blessed with the right way of seeing and interpreting, and whatever God tells you, you're going to know it. I mean, of course, out of the other side of your mouth, you can admit you're a sinner and imperfect, but somehow you think you have this special way of knowing what the Bible says and what God thinks, when other people who disagree with you would make the exact same claim. And they would say that God has told them to kill.
Yeah, no, I think we see a lot of this in the Islam culture, obviously right now with the 9/11 things and the terrorists.
Yeah.
And I think that's just a good example of bad religion, of somebody worshiping something that's not quite God.
Well, you say
it's bad. A lot of voices in their head that aren't from God.
You're saying it's bad because you don't like killing, but the God of the Old Testament loved killing. He ordered, He commanded, He committed killing, all sorts of things.
I don't think so. I think that's a bad description of God. I mean, I think from the very, very beginning, God showed us how to be redeemed. Adam and Eve covered themselves with some figs, and He killed an animal, covered them with the skin, because without the shedding of blood, there's no remission. And then He instituted the sacrifices, telling them about how one day, there will be another sacrifice that will take away all the sins. And that was passed on to Cain and to Abel, and we see Abel sacrificing correctly.
But
God doesn't love killing. God loves redeeming. But, people sin. The demons came down and did what they did. I mean, God had to do what He did in order to make things the way that they are.
So when the man was picking up sticks on the Sabbath, he's probably picking up sticks to build a fire. That's usually why they picked up sticks. And the people found him outside the camp. This is in Numbers. They said, "What should we do?" He was working on the Sabbath. So they took him to Moses, and Moses said, "Well, according to the command of God, this man should be killed." So the people took that man outside, and they stoned him to death in order to fulfill the command in the Ten Commandments. God's command, which was carried out by his own people, which was approved of and not denounced, was to kill a man for trying to pick up some kindling wood for his family. That, in my mind, is brutality. That is a love of killing in order to stick with some kind of a holy God who doesn't have any sense to know that sometimes your family needs to eat. That should be denounced, Jason, and you should join me in denouncing that kind of brutality and the kind of God who would endorse such actions. That is
sometimes
wrong.
your family needs to eat. I mean, have you ever skipped a meal for a day?
You're missing my point here. The Bible is filled with instances of God either commanding or committing or condoning killing. You know the story of Korah, don't you, in the Old Testament?
Well, I don't think I haven't responded to the one that you just said. I mean, and I like to respond to these things because you obviously have a picture of God that is kind of
comes out of the Bible.
In my opinion, is not a very good description of what he is or how he's doing things.
Well, then explain what I just talked to you about, the picking up sticks and being stoned to death by God's people.
I believe that things, and here's another one maybe, when I think his name was Uzziah, he grabbed the Ark of the Covenant as it was about to fall, and it was said that nobody could touch the Ark of the Covenant or they would die, and they weren't carrying it properly either, so it fell. And God killed them. And some a skeptic can say, why would God kill? God is not a loving God. I hate God. But there's a couple things that you need to note. One, God's laws are to be followed. Two, that sin is depravity. And most people don't understand the depth or the depravity of sin. That think that God's laws are just they're kind of like suggestions. They're not really laws. And I think they also teach us a lesson about how God designs the Sabbath, how God's holy, and ultimately, death for someone who believes in God is not a punishment. Death is glorification. It means going to heaven. It means leaving this earth. It's not the end-all, be-all of life. It's not a bad thing necessarily.
So basically, you're proving my point.
Okay.
Your explanation basically proves my point. It's up to me to decide whether I find this admirable or despicable, and I find it despicable. Any God who demands to be worshipped. What if I were to stand up and say, "Jason, worship me and do what I say, or else I'm going to kill you"? You would have me committed, wouldn't you?
You don't understand the therapeutic, dichotomous, divine results of your worship. I don't know if you've ever worshipped God before, but it's just as a release. Just to praise God, to sing, to throw your hands up, and when you're done with that, you feel fantastic.
So people are supposed to die and be killed so that Jason can feel fantastic with his hands raised?
No, we're talking about worship now. And
well, that's the point. Why God wants to be worshipped on the Sabbath. The Sabbath was set aside as a day to worship God. And this guy broke the Sabbath by picking up sticks to feed his family or to warm his house or whatever. And so since God's ego was offended because he wasn't properly being worshipped, this guy had to die by stoning. That is despicable. I'm sorry, you can paint it any way you like, but in my book, that is just brutality, and any Saddam Hussein or any other despotic dictator who wants to prove his power by force and by intimidation and by killing needs to be soundly renounced. And you should join me in renouncing that God.
How could you think that you would, let's say that how would you think you know more than God?
Well, how does God think he knows more than me? What a silly question. The whole point is that I do know enough about this God as described in the Bible. I know enough about him to make an informed decision.
No, what I'm meaning is that you say that this was evil and wrong for him to do this, so you're making a judgment on God, and what I'm saying is if there is an omnipotent being who knows everything, who's everywhere at once, then why can't this being do this act in order for the greater good, in order to fulfill his purpose?
Yeah, and the greater good is his glory, right? What if
Well,
Saddam
it's a
Hussein?
twofold purpose. Giving God glory and praise is obedience, it obeys him, and you get blessings for doing it. And in turn, there's a therapeutic and a blessing that you get, a value.
Well, Saddam Hussein could use the exact same argument.
Well, Saddam Hussein is not God, and we're not talking about human, we're talking about God.
But we're using the same. He could say, I have my reasons. I'm going to kill these dissenters. I have my reasons because I need to be respected, and it's good for you people to respect me. I don't buy that. I don't buy it if a dictator, no matter how powerful he is, if a dictator decrees that somehow his way is the right way and he knows more than I do, I need to obey him like a slave. I don't buy that, Jason. I'm smarter than that. I deserve better than that. I am better than it, and I'm nicer than that God, and so are you. Don't you hear the message I'm trying to point? You've closed your mind off to a slaving kind of obedience to this dictator that you think is wonderful, who has the power to kill you and smash you out. And you have redefined killing and brutality as a good thing.
You've thrown absolute truth out the window to the point where there's no sin, and anything can be justified. Somebody could murder somebody, and if their parents taught it was okay, then to Dan Barker it was okay.
I never
said that. Because they don't have absolute truth. They don't know what sin is. There is no sin.
I never said that.
You justified the Holocaust. You've justified apartheid.
Why do you think I'm saying that, Jason? I never said those things.
Because you justified every horrible sin if you say that there's no absolute truth outside of humankind.
No, I don't. I don't say that. That's your caricature of what an atheist says. I never say that.
There's got to be some truth outside of humankind, and you don't believe there is any.
I do believe there is truth with a lowercase t. Truth is not some reified, deified concept with a capital T that somehow exists out there that we're searching for. Truth is simply a label for a concept that statements either correspond with reality or they don't. And morality is simply the avoidance of unnecessary harm. And if I use the simple tools of morality that we all know, I apply those tools to the character of...
Why do we all know, and who is we?
Because we avoid pain. Human beings are natural creatures who want to avoid pain and want to continue our existence. We all know that. Unless you're mentally ill, you don't know that. But you know that all human beings want to avoid pain and avoid harm, and they want to continue their survival. We all know that, right?
I think that we may all agree on those things. Maybe.
Well, unless you're mentally ill in some way. I mean, sociopaths and other types of sick people.
But that's a really, really small thing to agree upon. We're talking about agreeing on all kinds of laws that protect people and love people and human rights.
But they're all based on that. They're all based on the avoidance of unnecessary harm. Every single one of those laws is based on minimizing harm to human beings in some ways. There is no other principle. It's either harmful or it isn't. It's either something to be avoided or it isn't. It's either enhances your survival or it doesn't. It all boils down to basically morality and ethics boil down to harm. And when I apply that, which you and I agree on, when I apply that to the God of the Bible, I see that he is not moral. He is not trying to avoid unnecessary harm. He's trying to create harm. He's trying to threaten. He's trying to be a bully. He's trying to intimidate. He's trying to shut mouths. He's trying to...
You've already given examples of people who don't agree with the thing you and I just agreed on. Saddam Hussein is one of them.
Well,
people do not agree on these things.
Well, but most of us do, fortunately. We have laws and systems of self-defense and systems of enforcement. Most of us are healthy. We're not all Hitlers. I mean, there are going to be, in our species, people who have something wrong with them, like Saddam Hussein. And the rest of us better well try to make sure that we minimize that kind of harm in the world. So,
what should we do with him? I mean, to him, he's right. To him, he's moral.
Yeah, but he's not right according to human morality. He's causing unnecessary harm.
Human morality is just the majority opinion, and majority opinion changes.
No, that's not right. I never said that. Human morality is the avoidance, is the minimizing of harm, the avoidance of harm. That's what morality is. It's not some cultural thing. I mean, of course there can be moral codes that are irrelevant to harm, like what kind of clothes you should wear. But we're talking about actual things that matter, what cause harm or enhance human life.
I'm saying some places like Indonesia or the islands off Indonesia, it's okay to eat people. Is that okay?
Well, no. Generally, it's not okay, and we should stop that, and we should try to minimize that if we are carrying people.
And why isn't it okay?
Because it causes unnecessary harm. That's pretty simple, isn't it? It causes harm that's not necessary. There might be a case to be made for an extreme, when we don't live our lives in extreme cases, but there's no absolute rule that it's always wrong to kill and cannibalize. But in general, since there are ways to avoid the harm, a moral person is going to take the way to avoid the harm. If you don't take that way, then you're an immoral person, like Saddam Hussein. That's a pretty basic principle of ethics.
It just seems that you're walking a real slippery slope if you're trying to impose your ethics and your definition of morality on other people and say this is what morality is, this should be obeyed, you sound basically like the God of the Bible, but you have become that person.
No, that's not at all what I'm saying. Don't insult me by comparing me with that brutal guy in the Bible. Those of us who consider ourselves to be moral, we don't have absolute rules. Sometimes it is wrong to lie, and sometimes it is right to tell a lie. And sometimes it's wrong to kill. Most of the time, it's wrong to kill because there's other ways. There's ways of minimizing the harm in other ways. Once in a while, in self-defense, it might be justifiable to kill. Okay, I'm not saying there's absolute rules that must always be followed. We use our minds. We assess the situation. We try to pick a path through life that minimizes the amount of harm committed by or to other human beings and other creatures on this planet. That's ethics. That's morality. And that principle is violated repeatedly by the God of the Bible. I do not respect that God.
Well, when is it okay to lie?
Suppose some woman comes to your door. Mm-hmm. She's bruised and bloody, and she's crying, and she says her husband's trying to kill her. So you bring her in, you clean her up, give her a meal, give her a place to stay. And then her deranged husband comes knocking on your front door saying, "Do you know where my wife is?" You better lie to that man. If you're a moral person, you should lie to that man. You should not tell him the truth. Telling him the truth would cause a risk of more harm.
Isn't that sentence just contradictory in itself? If you're a moral person, you better lie?
Yes, because lying can sometimes be the most moral thing to do. It's not an absolute thing. Sometimes lying is the good moral thing to do.
You don't think that could be accomplished by saying something else, or giving a non-answer, or not opening the door?
Well, he's asking you, do you know where my wife is?
It's none of your business.
Are you going to say yes?
You have a lot of options, I'm saying, besides lying.
Well, you're going to mislead him in some way. You're going to mislead that man because you want to minimize the harm. Telling him a lie would be a good thing to do. Humanists and ethical people don't make these absolute rules that you must always do something. You weigh the situation. You analyze it. Usually telling a lie leads to more harm, and usually we should not tell lies. But there are cases in life, even in the Bible there were cases of deception that were used for God's glory. The prostitute, Rahab, what was her name? They lied about her existence, and it was to God's glory, and she became one of the ancestors of Jesus. But,
and she's mentioned in the Hall of Faith, but it's interesting to know that she was not, that her lie was not mentioned in the Hall of Faith. And, that's been talked about before. Now, could the same thing have been accomplished if she did not lie? And my feelings are, yes, absolutely. God.
Yeah, but you're working on the assumption that it's always wrong to tell a lie. Sometimes telling a lie is the right moral thing to do. It might be regrettable, but in the situation, you would want to mislead that husband who's outside your front door. You would wish to mislead him so that he would go away. And telling a lie would not be anything that you should be ashamed of. You should lie to his face and be proud of it.
All right, well, listen, I really enjoyed our conversation today. Did you want a minute or two to have some closing statements?
Just a couple seconds here. The Freedom from Religion Foundation is an organization of atheists and agnostics and other types of non-believers. We're not all atheists. And many of us are former believers, and a few of us, I know more than 20 other former preachers who are ordained clergy. We're not just a bunch of angry people who don't like religion. We care about truth wherever it leads. If anyone else is interested in knowing more, and if any of your listeners are questioning their faith and find the way I talk to be somewhat attractive, then I invite you to see our webpage at ffrf.org.
Okay. Well, once again, I really appreciate your conversation, and I look forward to talking to you again sometime.
Thanks for the invite, Jason.
Yeah, you're welcome so much, and I will give you an email.
Oh, very good.
And